Are you looking for me? The moment the voice entered his ears, Derek froze. His skin tensed up, and his hair stood on end. Why is he behind me? Why is he in my room? What happened to the seal? What about the effects of the mystical items? His forehead dripped with cold sweat, and he subconsciously wanted to turn around to take a look. But his instincts stopped him from doing so. This instinct originated from the teachings of the City of Silver's general knowledge of monsters' lessons and the strange scene he had experienced after joining the patrolling teams. When someone is speaking behind you, don't turn around in a hurry. Derek raised his hands and clenched them into fists in front of his chest, then slowly, he turned around, bit by bit. The room was shrouded in darkness, making it impossible to see anything. However, there was a tin of golden light that was expanding in his two eyes, transforming into what seemed like two miniature suns. With his light suppliant powers, he saw a dark figure sitting quietly on the edge of his bed. The dark figure rapidly turned clear, revealing a head that had been split in half. In the middle of his head, two gray brains wriggled like they were alive, trying to get close to each other but being unable to do so. The thick, viscous liquid on the severed surface of his brain had turned into thin threads, but they were shrinking like maggots. Each eye that was on the two separate sides were distanced apart, and the nose bridge was separated from the middle. The color of the blood was bright and evident. The left side of his mouth was open, but the right side of his mouth was tightly shut. This terrifying monster was naked, and there were numerous dark red wounds on its body. The countless wounds had torn open savagely, revealing rows and rows of white teeth. They said the same sentence in quick succession, "Are you looking for me?" It paused for a moment, the corners of its mouth and the edges of its wounds were curling up. Look, am I not normal? Derek's pupils contracted, and without thinking, he placed his folded hands on his chest and raised them to his chin, as if in prayer. The small room suddenly became bright, and a pure beam of light, swirling with fire, fell from the roof and onto the monster's body. The beam was not as grand as the one used by Derek outside the spire. This was because of the seal here and the mystical item which left him isolated from the spire's exterior. But at that moment, Derek was stunned to see the holy light beam that he had prayed for was suddenly thickening. It was so bright that he couldn't help but close his eyes. A few moments later, something purer and thicker separated from the magnificent pillar of light. It was like a man made of light with no facial features and no clothes. The man of light suddenly coruscated and pounced on the monster. All the mouths on the monster suddenly opened, as if it was letting out a blood-curdling screech. Yet, Derek heard nothing. The monster began to tremble violently and quickly disintegrated under the burning and illumination of the man of light, disappearing as if it were melting. Just as it was about to become transparent, a phantom wearing a black classical long robe and a pointed hat suddenly appeared. The shadow had black hair, black eyes, a wide forehead, and a thin face. It wore a monocle carved from crystal. As soon as he appeared, the man of light exploded, and Derek's vision was filled with whiteness. When his eyesight was restored, he found himself outside the room, in the corridor with the metal lamps set in it, in the dim light of the setting sun. He tilted his head blankly and looked into the room. He saw a tall, muscular figure in dark trousers and a brown coat. In front of this figure was the bed which Derek had been sleeping in. Dawn-like rays of light condensed onto a white leg bone, turning it into a pure white, sharp sword. Next to the straight sword lay a translucent worm. It was only the length of a thumb, and its slimness was almost that of a child's finger. One ring after another, of completely transparent colors, divided it into many sections. It was a fleeting scene, and without specially counting the number of rings, he had a vague feeling that there were about 10 of them. The tall figure which had its back facing him reached out his hand to pick up the strange translucent worm. As he turned around, he sighed. It was close. At that moment, Derek finally saw the face of the tall figure. His hair was grizzled, unkempt, and rather disheveled. He had deep wrinkles around his cheeks, but there were no wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. Some old scars that were either deep or twisted remained on his cheeks. He was dressed in a flaxen-colored shirt with a checkered leather belt around his waist, and his pale blue eyes were deep and weathered, like a book full of stories. For a moment, Derek was stunned, and then, as though he had been in danger all his life, he opened his mouth in pleasant surprise. "Your Excellency." In front of him was Chief of the City of Silver's 6-member council, a powerful demon hunter who was over 100 years old, Colin Iliad. Colin nodded slightly and said, "We always knew that he had a problem, but in order to find out what kind of ulterior motives the man named Eamon had, we intentionally didn't eliminate him directly, and we instead locked him at the bottom of the spire, sealed under the influence of mystical items, and we often let Beyonders, who only have symptoms of losing control, live next to him and talk to him. We wanted to see if we could induce some abnormal changes in him in order to learn the information we wanted to know. Unfortunately, he had been very normal until today, way too normal. Why do you think he suddenly mutated and attempted to break through the seal? Do you have any idea what makes you different from the others? So it was purposely arranged for me to live next to the former exploration team captain. After a few seconds of silence, Derek said, maybe it's because my Beyonder pathway is different from the others. Sequence 9 Bard, Sequence 8 Light Suppliant. In other words, the Sun pathway. If Mr. Hanged Man is right, that the Aemon family is the descendant of an ancient sun god, then it's normal for me to cause a mutation to happen to him. Derek felt he knew the truth to a certain extent. Colin listened without a change in expression. He sized up Derek for a few seconds before saying, we were monitoring him. The members of the 6-member council took turns, but we didn't expect him to suddenly mutate. There were 0 warning signs, and his actions were very decisive and determined. What were you doing in the room just now? Derek, who was considering the relationship between the sun pathway and the ancient sun god, didn't instantly realize what the chief was asking about. When he realized it, his mind was still blank as he seriously recalled what he had done. I didn't do anything. I just knocked on the wall and tried to talk to him. Before this, I was participating in the tarot gathering. The tarot gathering. Derek was suddenly stunned. He felt that things might not be as simple as he had imagined. He knew that he couldn't inform the chief of his thoughts, but he didn't know what kind of expression to make, so he could only maintain his lonely, reserved silence. He said thoughtfully, I knocked on that wall 3 times. Before that, the candle in my room had extinguished, and there was complete darkness. I had tried to practice some of my Beyonder powers. Colin looked into Derek's eyes quietly and said after nearly 20 seconds, unfortunately, what Aemon left in his soul was not his original body. Moreover, this matter happened too suddenly, so we were unable to obtain the desired result. Before his mutation, did you sense anything amiss? No. Derek shook his head with conviction. Colin's eyes suddenly flashed with 2 complex, dark green symbols, and he reflected Derek's body in them. After nearly 10 seconds of silence, the City of Silver's chief closed his eyes and said, your condition has stabilized. You don't need any more treatment, so you can go back now. Derek was startled. All right. He watched demon hunter Colin Iliad turn back into the room, pick up the sharp white sword, and turn it over and over in his hands. He quietly took a deep breath and walked along the corridor towards the exit. On the way, he met the keepers who had rushed over one after the other. He slowly walked back home and closed the door. He carefully observed his surroundings for a while, then he sat down on the edge of the bed and recited in a low voice, the fool that doesn't belong to this era. You are the mysterious ruler above the grey fog. You are the king of yellow and black who wields good luck. I've just experienced something terrifying. Derek recounted what had happened and mentioned his 2 guesses. After doing all of that, he felt much more at ease. And with his tense state of mind relaxing, he felt immense exhaustion wash through him. He lied down and quickly fell asleep. In the silent and dark room, flashes of lightning would occasionally illuminate everything. Otherwise, it would seem like the dark night. The sleeping Derek suddenly flicked his right index finger and leisurely tapped it on the bed. Once, twice, thrice. After the tarot gathering, Klein didn't divine the werewolf's Beyonder characteristic or the biological poison bottle due to his spirituality expenditure. Instead, he went straight back to the real world for a nap. After 20 minutes, he woke up and drew the curtain, allowing the light that penetrated through the mist to bring a certain degree of light into the room. Sitting on the chair in front of the desk, Klein calmed down and began considering what he needed to do in the short term. The main goal is to continue concluding the rules of a magician and make adjustments according to the subtle feedback from my spirituality. Although rules like never performing unprepared, the need to have a stage in a performance, and completing a performance using means of diversion, do not seem problematic at the moment, if I were to continue acting this way and performing slight adjustments, I'll eventually digest the potion and reach the advancement state. But this sort of acting isn't sufficient. I'm still lacking some of the important rules. Currently, what I'm doing will make the digestion slow and not thorough. Perhaps it will take a year, or perhaps even 2 or 3 years before my sequence advancement is possible. And Inns Zangul won't remain there waiting for me. Only through becoming a high-sequence Beyonder as soon as possible will I be qualified to take revenge. Therefore, figuring out the other magician rules is of utmost importance. I'll first determine them through experimentation whether the applause from an audience will stir my spirituality and result in better digestion of the potion. Just as Klein was deep in thought, he heard a series of illusory, stacked pleas. Report chapter. A male voice? Is it Mr. Hanged Man or Little Sun? Klein looked out the window at the gloomy sky, got up, went into the bathroom next door. He locked the door, took 4 steps counterclockwise, and arrived above the gray fog. Within that mysterious space, a towering, ancient palace quietly stood. The illusory male voice echoed in a stacked, continuous manner. Klein glanced at it and confirmed that the prayer was from Little Sun. He sat in the fool's seat and stretched out his right hand, emanating his spirituality to touch the corresponding crimson star. Suddenly, the voice became clear and layered, and Klein quickly figured out what the sun was talking about. The former captain of the exploration team, who had seen Eamon, suddenly lost control and strangely penetrated through the seal, arriving at his room. Fortunately, the City of Silver took this matter seriously and had been constantly prepared for it. Otherwise, it would have led to a tragedy. The Sun believes that it's impossible that there was no reason for the man's loss of control. He came up with 2 possibilities. One was that his own Beyonder pathway met the requirements of being the ancient sun god's descendant, and the other possibility was that the man might have sensed the tarot gathering and Mr. Fool's secret pull. If it were the former, he wouldn't have waited until today and waited until the end of the tarot gathering before losing control. The latter reason has a greater probability. This is the first time I've encountered someone who can sense the matters regarding the gray fog. That Eamon is very scary. It's no wonder their family was known as the Blasphemers during the 4th epoch. Even their last names are taboo. Klein subconsciously looked at the crimson star and the corresponding supplicant. He carefully observed the blurry image of Little Sun to see if there was anything abnormal with him. Klein believed that Eamon wouldn't be so easily eliminated. Even if it was as the chief of the City of Silver had said, that his body wasn't his main body, it didn't make it any easier to eliminate him. The only possibility is that the powerhouses in the City of Silver have been using mystical items to monitor him, but is that even possible? When he decided to let the former leader of the exploration team lose control and silently penetrate through the seal, he definitely had a plan in place. In the midst of his thoughts, Klein's eyes suddenly froze as he looked at the prayer scene. Entwined on the indistinct body of the sun was a translucent and illusory figure. He had hands and feet, but he was like a python, twisting around the sun while his head rested behind the sun's head. In the blurred image, he was wearing a black classical robe, a pointed hat, and a crystal monocle. The sun didn't notice any of this. Klein almost drew a cold gasp, shocked at the strange means that were available to that entity. He vaguely understood the other party's intention. By residing in the spirit body of the sun, he is waiting for the next tarot gathering, allowing him to sneak above the gray fog, like a virus or a Trojan horse. When that happens, my control over this mysterious space might be snatched away. He's truly a blasphemer. Fortunately, Little Sun is rather naive and straightforward, so he immediately reported this to me. Through the corresponding crimson stars and the power of the gray fog, I was able to discover his peculiar state. Klein drew a breath and tried to calm himself. At that moment, he had to respond. He had to quickly think of a way to get Eamon out of the sun, or temporarily expel the sun out of the tarot gathering. Looking at himself, from his Beyonder powers of magician, clown, and seer, to Azek's copper whistle, the Dark Emperor card, the all-black eye, the sun brooch, the biological poison bottle, and so on, Klein couldn't find a way to deal with Eamon. Amon's sequence is definitely above sequence 4, and the means available to him must be sufficiently strange. To be able to escape from the City of Silver's mystical artifacts and powerful demon hunters, it means that he isn't something which can be easily eliminated with ordinary objects or powers. After thinking for a moment and looking around, Klein discovered there was only one possibility of eliminating Eamon: the gray fog, this mysterious space. I have to think of a way to pry its power away. The sacrifice and bestowment ritual from before are examples. With this train of thought, Klein turned his gaze to the Book of Secrets. This mysticism book, which originated from the ancient shaman King Klarman, recorded many mysterious rituals that required help from the primitive moon. Klein, who had been reading it before, vaguely remembered that a few of them were suitable for such a scenario. Of course, it was unknown what changes he would have to make after directing it towards the Fool. He could only keep his hopes up and try his best. As Klein flipped through the book, his eyes stopped at a ritual. Blood Moon Sacrifice. This ritualistic magic was clearly different from the simple ones that Klein had learned before, and it used the element of a secret deed. The process was to use a material rich in spirituality, preferably the blood of a Byander, to write the honorable name of the target of the secret deed on an animal hide, and to draw the corresponding symbols and magic labels. If necessary, the specific circumstances of a given time and place also had to be taken into account. When this was done, the ritual host would set up the altar, pick up the piece of hide, and repeat the honorable name, letting their spirituality to seep into the hide, gradually spreading it out, little by little to form a hidden bond with the corresponding great being, and obtaining the corresponding spiritual experience or help. The final outcome of this ritual was unknown. It all depended on what the hidden or great being bestowed. Or rather, according to one's characteristics, the knowledge and power one could gain through that secret bond were also different. This kind of rather vague and subjective ritual gave Klein enough freedom to modify and manipulate it. If he had assumed the stance of forcefully eliminating Aemon from the beginning, then Aemon would have certainly resisted and created a dangerous accident. If the target of the secret deed were the true creator or the hidden sage, it's normal for the ritual to end in madness. Klein mumbled as he conjured a pen and paper and began to modify the Blood Moon Sacrifice to turn it into a secret deed ritual that belonged to the fool. First, he replaced the honorable name with the 3 sentences of King of Yellow and Black. Then, he replaced the symbolic symbol with the one behind the seat of the fool. It was a unique symbol made up of a part of the hidden pupil-less eye and the contorted lines. The third was to design the corresponding magic label according to the symbols and his mysticism knowledge. This was the most difficult step. Any mistakes would cause the entire ritual to produce unpredictable developments. Lastly, he had to modify the layout of the altar to make it closer to the fool and to the King of Yellow and Black. After busying himself for quite a while, Klein had a new secret deed ritual, but he was unsure if it would work. He examined it over and over again, and after confirming that there were no mistakes, he emanated his spirituality and heavily replied to Little Sun, "I'm aware. I have something to task you with. Let's see if this ritual works." Ellipsis. The son Derek suddenly woke up from his dreamless slumber. Before his eyes were the boundless grey fog and the lofty fool. His ears echoed with bits of illusory and distant words. He knew that Mr. Fool would occasionally ask the members of the Tarot Club to make small attempts as if to verify something. He wasn't surprised by this, and he immediately sat up and began to search for a monster hide, exotic herbs, and other objects. As for the spiritual materials described in the ceremony, Derek didn't waste time heading to the Spire or the underground market to buy them. He picked up the axe of Hurricane and sliced a tiny wound in his arm. Silently, he used his own blood as ink, and he wrote the name of the fool and its corresponding symbols and magic labels on the pitted monster hide. After a while, he put down the quill that was stained with blood. He saw many mysterious symbols on the hide, and the colors were bright red and had an indescribable hint of demonic dealings. After dealing with the wound on his arm, the pale-faced Derek quickly finished setting up the altar. He picked up the blood-red word and all kinds of terrifying symbols from the hide and held it tightly in his hand. He looked at the flickering candle flame in front of him, closed his eyes, lowered his head, and repeatedly recited the honorable names of the fool that doesn't belong to this era, the mysterious ruler above the grey fog, the King of Yellow and Black who wields good luck. Ellipsis. Derek's spirituality slowly flowed out and infused the hide, and the words in Jotun and the magic symbols on it quickly brightened. It was a startling crimson color. At that moment, he, who had already entered into a cogitation state, was only feeling his psyche gradually dissipate as it floated to an immeasurable height, coming into contact with the grayish-white fog, and the hidden great being. Above the grey fog, inside the palace that looked like a giant's residence. Noticing that the sun had not shown any signs of delay in preparing the ritual, Klein chose to wait there above the grey fog. Suddenly, he felt the entire mysterious space start to tremble. That motionless grayish-white fog started to flow. The crimson star corresponding to the sun shined brightly and emitted illusory rays of light like the tide. These countless rays of light condensed into a blurry figure of the sun. He was in a supplicating position with his eyes closed and his head lowered, waiting for the moment when he could bond with the great being and gain a miraculous spiritual experience. The translucent figure on his body was still tightly coiled like a python, but its head was already tilted back as it looked up. The crystal monocle it wore flashed dimly. He's searching for the subtle, hidden connection. He should have recognized that this is just a secret deed ritual, but he didn't do anything to stop it. Is he trying to find the connection through it? Klein suddenly came to this realization, and felt the gray fog and the mysterious space above it simultaneously rippling with power. However, for the time being, Klein couldn't combine these forces with his own spirituality to create a Beyonder effect that could exorcise the evil spirit, unless there was another corresponding ritual. Clearly, this was impossible. He couldn't maintain two rituals simultaneously. Klein's eyes quickly swept the area in front of him, and his gaze stopped at the sun brooch. Perhaps I can use it as a bridge. Just as this thought flashed through Klein's mind, his right hand grabbed the sunbird-shaped dark golden brooch. At the same time, he used his spirituality as a whirlpool to attract the pride power from the mysterious space towards him, making it surge towards the sun brooch like a tidal wave. The quivering above the gray fog became obvious. Little dots of pure light intertwined and swept toward Klein, blending with his spirituality. The sunbird-shaped dark golden brooch began to glow with a dazzling brilliance. It grew brighter and denser, and in an instant, drop after drop of a translucent golden liquid began to condense. The liquid quickly merged together and formed a human figure that was as tall as Klein. It was a golden figure, a sacred figure. It does work. Sun holy water that's created from a higher level of power is closer to a god's bestowment. Klein's heart was filled with joy. He turned his gaze back to the crimson star which symbolized the sun. He then looked at the figure that was waiting to bond with the great being. As for the divine figure condensed by the golden sun holy water, it wasn't a result of the sun brooch, but simply a manifestation of Klein's subconscious thoughts. Reaching this step, he had already allowed the golden figure to move forward. Through the illusory crimson star, it merged with Little Sun through the secret deed ritual as it dispelled the evil spirit hidden inside his body, as well as giving him a certain amount of knowledge and a miraculous spiritual experience. However, Klein didn't have much confidence at that very moment. The power of the mysterious space was obviously higher than his spirituality, making him unable to smoothly control the power. As such, the power of the golden figure was mixed, chaotic, and insufficiently coordinated. If he used it as is, the effect was, at most, 10% of what he expected. As for Aemon, who was suspected to be a descendant of the ancient sun god, he was born into a family of blasphemers in the Tudor Empire's fourth epoch. Even if it wasn't his main body, he was able to successfully hide his identity from the powerful high-sequence demon hunter and the powerful mystical items that protected the existence of the City of Silver. Klein truly didn't have much confidence with the effect only amounting to 10%. His initial plan was only to give it a try. If it really didn't work, he would temporarily bar the sun and then reconnect with him when he found a better solution. However, having come this far, Klein naturally wanted the best outcome and strived to succeed in one go. Having disguised himself as the godlike fool, he too had a little pride, and he wanted to keep up his reputation. He gave a self-deprecating laugh as he prepared to find a way to increase the effects of the golden figure to dispel the evil entity at the last moment. Of course, I can only waste a few seconds. Otherwise, the ritual would be over. Klein's eyes swept over the items on the long bronze table again, thinking only of the words, high level. Due to his spirituality's intuition as a seer, his gaze landed on an item. The card of blasphemy, the Dark Emperor card. Of all the items Klein owned, it was the only one that matched the words, high level. As for Azek's copper whistle, Klein clearly remembered that it had been completely suppressed when the Blackthorn Security Company faced off with the spawn of the evil god. However, what the Dark Emperor card's high level pertains to is the knowledge contained inside. That's not right. After the owner advances to become a high-sequence Beyonder, it can produce subtle responses with the Beyonder ingredients that are needed. Furthermore, it also possesses the characteristics of anti-divination and anti-prophecy. In other words, its level isn't low. I don't need to use it for a fight. As long as I can use its high level to suppress the power of this mysterious space above the fog, and if I can minimize the chaotic and unnatural coordination of the golden figure, that will be enough. Klein quickly came up with an idea. He reached out his hand towards the Dark Emperor card which had its back facing up. Just then, he noticed a frightening scene through the corner of his eyes. Within the shadow of the sun that was formed by the illusory rays of the crimson star, a palm, so shriveled that only skin and bones remained, was suddenly reaching forward. Slowly but firmly, it grabbed at the boundary of the crimson star, giving off a feeling as if it was piercing through reality and entering the psyche domain. Aemon was attempting to use the connection to rip open the boundary and extend his hand into the grey fog. Whoosh! For the first time, the endless grayish-white fog was in chaos. The flowing from before seemed to turn into waves as gales formed. Klein's pupil shrank. He no longer hesitated, and he picked up the Dark Emperor card. As soon as he held this item in his hand, he immediately felt that his spirituality was no longer subdued by the power of the mysterious space. Suddenly, the golden figure became abnormally tall, and on its back, it grew pairs of enormous pitch-black wings. There were a total of 12 pairs. On each pair of wings, there were dark and bright feathers engraved with many mysterious symbols. The contrast between gold and black was stark, and the huge figure, driven by Klein, spread its wings to cover the vast dome of the towering palace. Without a sound, the sacred yet corrupted figure of light and darkness flashed overlapping with the manifestation of Little Sun that was formed by the Crimson Star. The light and shadows intersected, and a fierce wind blew in all directions. The palm that was so shriveled that it didn't have any flesh, to the point of only having skin and bones left, shrank backward uncontrollably, but it also firmly refused to retreat. It was like a man falling off a cliff who had extended his hand to grab a bulge, unwilling to let go regardless of what happened. Whoosh! In the midst of the illusory and chaotic sounds, light and darkness completely erupted. The shriveled hand finally lost its support, and it plummeted, constantly disintegrating and disappearing as it did. After a few seconds, the gray fog and the mysterious space above it returned to its previous tranquility, as if no one had stepped inside for thousands of years. Klein focused again and saw that the blurry figure of Little Sun was no longer entangled with the twisted and incorporeal entity. Phew! Unable to stop himself, he heaved a sigh of relief. Then, he conjured the contrasting image from before and threw them at the manifested figure of Little Sun in the crimson rays of light, allowing him to fully comprehend them. In the Berg household in the City of Silver, Derek felt both awake and adrift at the same time. It was as if he could see shadows of ineffable shapes, different colors of light that contained endless knowledge, and a majestic, tall, golden figure looking down upon everything. This figure stood beside Mr. Fool in the thick gray fog, with 12 pairs of huge, dark, mysterious wings on his back. Not only did his body and mind become warm and pure, but he also seemed to understand what was called sunlight. He had even figured out holy water creation, as well as the knowledge to exorcise evil spirits. It also contained images he couldn't understand, such as a towering, hidden pyramidal mausoleum. In that intoxicating spiritual experience, it was as if he had returned to his most carefree childhood, to the lands where the sun shone in his imagination, and it was only when everything was gone and the simple furnishings of his room came into view that he snapped back to his senses. Is this the secret deed ritual as referenced in textbooks? For more than 2,000 years, no one in the City of Silver has succeeded before. No one has been able to come into contact with a mighty existence. At that moment, Derek's low spirits and loneliness lessened. A heartfelt smile beamed on his face. The Fool's so-called experiment was to confirm whether our City of Silver's environment can perform a secret deed ritual. That wondrous feeling of all that knowledge was the payment he gave me. Derek lowered his head again and said with great respect, "Thank you, Mr. Fool." Right at this moment, a grayish-white fog suddenly appeared in front of his eyes. In the center of the fog was a lofty chair. It was the leisurely seated Fool. Then, Derek saw himself covered in a transparent, illusory shadow. The figure wore a black classic robe, a matching pointed hat, and a crystal monocle hung from its face. It coiled around his body like a python. This, Aemon wasn't dead. He evaded the detection of the mystical items and the attention of His Excellency, and he became a parasite on my spirit body. Derek's eyes widened, and he saw himself as he was now, no longer entangled by Aemon. Did Mr. Fool notice him and finish him? Derek's sunken heart calmed down while cold sweat trickled down his forehead due to the lingering fear. His face, on the other hand, displayed an expression of instinctive reverence. He subconsciously followed the words described in the mythology course and said, "Praise you, the mighty Mr. Fool." Somewhere in the deep darkness, a bolt of lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the surroundings. This was a plain that was filled with ravines, and a dark green single-eyed giant was wandering about subconsciously. His eyes were lifeless, and his face was covered with traces of rotting pus. Grayish-yellow gas permeated from his body and interwoven in the air, forming many clouds. And beneath his feet, in the darkest ravine on the plain, there was a figure standing at the edge, overlooking the land below. With the help of the lightning, a thick and broad grayish-white building could be vaguely seen at the bottom of the ravine. The figure was dressed in a black classic robe and a pointed cap of the same color. It had curly black hair, black eyes, a broad forehead, and thin cheeks. It looked identical to the phantom Derek Berg had seen. He raised his hand and pinched the crystal monocle. Then, he turned his head to the left and looked into the distance. As expected, he suddenly whispered, in the language of ancient Fasak. After pausing for a moment, the man smiled and said the words, "The fool." Before he finished speaking, he had already jumped into the ravine in front of him. At this moment, the lightning subsided for a second, and darkness completely enveloped the world. After eliminating the fatal threat, Klein returned to the real world, once again feeling the urgent need to advance his sequence. The Amon that I eliminated wasn't the main body. If he truly is interested in the mysterious space above the gray fog, he will soon return to the City of Silver. At that time, I wonder if the 2 legendary mystical items and the 3 demon hunters will be able to stop him. For a mere clone to be so bizarre and terrifying, one can imagine how powerful his main body is. Therefore, I need to conclude the rest of the magician rules as soon as possible and, through digestion and advancement, better grasp the mysterious space above the gray. Perhaps the City of Silver's Shepherd Elder will be used. If she really is corrupted by the true creator. Klein opened the bathroom door and went down to the first floor while in deep thought. What about the rest of the magician's rules? As Klein idly leafed through the newspaper he had finished reading, he thought about the issues that mattered most to him. He had already considered one point before, and that was the difference between having an audience to cheer for him and not having one. However, just this alone didn't seem sufficient. With this thought, Klein's thoughts ran wild as he inexplicably thought of something. When I was still a seer, being recognized and praised as a true fortune-teller would give me a feeling that the process of digesting the magic potion had become faster. After I concluded the seer principles, I began to believe that there was no direct correlation between the views and feedback from others and that they were merely expressions, nothing substantial. If I act well enough, I would naturally be acknowledged, and my digestion would naturally be faster. That is to say, I had always believed that they were 2 different responses with the same gains, and not something related to causality. But now, there's the choice of receiving an audience's applause. If it does help me digest the potion, does it mean that some performances really require feedback, and the way that others view me can subtly affect the progress of my potion's digestion? By extension, would the establishment of the churches by the 7 Orthodox gods, the spreading of their faith, and the nurturing of their followers partially be a result of this? Ellipsis. This is truly a sacrilegious thought. I am indeed not a person who sincerely worships gods. I will praise them, but I won't blindly believe in them. Klein quickly adjusted his train of thought as he searched for another angle of attack. He repeatedly compared the subtle differences between seer, clown, and magician. Gradually, he came up with an idea. In comparison, does a magician, who needs to perform, possess the need to take the initiative? Taking the initiative to perform instead of being passive like a seer or clown? From the perspective of fate, it also fits. From a seer's reverence of fate, a clown's characteristic of being teased by fate while still maintaining a smile, and finally a magician who takes the initiative to challenge fate. Even if the result is nothing real or substantial, he will still receive the audience's applause from his deception. Klein nodded indiscernibly as he planned to make attempts in taking the initiative to perform. Where should I start? It should be something relatively less dangerous. I can consider the imprisonment of that vampire named Emlyn White by Father Utravsky. However, I need to confirm that this group of non-humans abide by the law and only engage in petty theft at the worst. Where do Emlyn's companions stay on the southern side of the bridge? I can't really remember. I'll have to use divination to jog my memories. I'll also confirm how dangerous it is. Having come to this conclusion, Klein put down the newspaper, got up, and went upstairs. It had to be said that he didn't have any other motivation to actively involve himself in something that had almost nothing to do with him. It wasn't his personality, but in order to act, he had to force himself to do so. This is considered rather simple for me. How would a straight male act as a witch and demoness of pleasure? It's no wonder the City of Silver emphasizes that, you're only acting. Klein suddenly understood the meaning of the admonition. City of Silver, in a dark room at the top of the spire. Chief of the 6-member council, Colin Iliad, stood in front of a window, staring at the Silver City which was shrouded in darkness and lightning. Those beams of light illuminated his disheveled white hair, revealing his twisted and hideous old scars on his face, as well as the deep wrinkles on his face and his worried eyes. After an unknown period of time, Colin turned and looked at a dark corner. He asked in a deep voice, "Find anything?" In the corner, a shadow stood up. It was pitch black as it shot towards the wall, twisting and whirling. Its voice carried the feeling of metal rubbing against metal, and it was rather jarring to the ears. After Derek Berg returned home, he showed some signs of abnormality, but there was no immediate need to deal with it. Colin nodded slightly and said, "What did he do?" With the help of the mystical item at the bottom of the spire, the Rampager and the clone of the mysterious figure were eliminated. However, he had constantly suspected that the matter had not been completely resolved. The former captain of the exploration team suddenly lost control. The mysterious person recklessly took action after enduring for a full 42 years, without any consideration for the traps or the consequences. All of this made Colin, who had killed and hunted many monsters, instinctively feel that something was amiss. Therefore, he believed that this was a deliberate choice made by the mysterious man. Although the real purpose of the mysterious man was still unknown, he definitely had some sort of follow-up method, and it wouldn't be so simple to get rid of him. After using his demon hunter powers and finding no abnormalities, he deliberately pretended to be deceived and directly permitted the youth named Derek Berg to return home. However, he had secretly sent someone to monitor the situation closely. This was completely different from the detention and observation method which Colin had used in the past. It was a change he had no choice but to make. The black shadow that was slightly gyrating replied. After he entered the room, he sat on the edge of the bed and muttered to himself for quite a while. As I was afraid that the mysterious man would discover me, I didn't get too close, so I couldn't clearly hear what was being said. However, I can confirm that this is an abnormal sign. After talking to himself, Derek seemed to become very tired and fell asleep very quickly. But after a short nap, he suddenly woke up and conducted a ritual. I suspect that his mind wasn't lucid while doing so and that he was controlled by the mysterious man. By the way, the ritual had elements of a secret deed. Colin pondered for a while and said with a solemn expression, as expected. Perhaps he was communicating with his main body via this method. What exactly is his purpose? Why did he spend his 42 years at the bottom of the spire in peace? The black shadow naturally couldn't answer this question as it continued. After the ritual, Derek no longer showed any abnormal behavior. Does this matter need to be dealt with immediately? If that mysterious person's main body is attracted here, we might not be able to deal with him. Colin remained silent for a few seconds before saying, "Continue the observation. That mysterious person has yet to show any substantial malice, so our reaction can't be too intense." Sigh, do you remember that prophecy? It's almost time for disaster to befall. The further we explore, the more strange ruins we find, and the more dangerous the items we harvest. By your will, Your Excellency. The black shadow slowly retreated back into the ground and disappeared. At this moment, in the Berg household, Derek began to cough so violently that his heart seemed to almost burst. Cough, cough, cough. He crouched down and coughed non-stop until his throat began to itch, and he coughed out something. Splat! A translucent object slid across his throat and fell to the ground. It was a worm with the length and thickness of a finger. There were some transparent areas on its body, forming rings. Derek had seen something like this at the bottom of the spire previously, and he was certain that he was already free of Amon's influence. He bent down and picked up the translucent worm, and finally, he was able to count the total number of rings on its body. There were a total of 12. What is its use? What can it be used for? It seems to be dead. Derek lost himself in thought. Winter County in the northern part of the Lowen Kingdom. A black Gothic cathedral towered over the snow-covered mountains as it occupied a vast stretch of land. In front of it was a cliff, and its surroundings was a vast expanse of whiteness with utmost silence. This was the church of the Evernight goddess's headquarters, known as the Cathedral of Serenity. The dark-haired, green-eyed Leonard Mitchell had a black windbreaker draped over him as he wore red gloves and walked out of his room. Having successfully advanced and stabilized himself, he hadn't been given the opportunity to participate in any operations yet, as well as some exercises and so-called mysticism courses. After going around a corner, Leonard saw a staircase leading down. There, he saw Captain Dunn Smith, with a pair of dark grey eyes and dressed in a black windbreaker, and Klein Moretti, who exuded a bookish demeanor standing there, smiling and waiting. He tilted his head back and sighed. My memory has also gotten worse. I've already forgotten that the two of you no longer exist. Leonard looked away and walked down the stairs to the first floor of the cathedral. He knocked on the door and entered a small room. There were chairs in the room, and some nighthawks wearing red gloves sat around inside. Leonard found a seat at random and sat down, smiling as he chatted with his friends. After a while, the high-ranking deacon, Crested Sesimer, with his propped-up collar covering his chin and lips, walked in, sat right in front, and said to the crowd, "Today's class will inform you of things you need to pay attention to. As Red Gloves, you will travel to different places, and there's a high chance of encountering dangerous high-sequence beyonders. If their intent is obvious, and they want to kill you, the only thing you can do is leave a trail behind you so that the subsequent investigators will be able to find the appropriate clues. The exact methods include, but most of the time, high-sequence beyonders won't always attack you directly. They will utilize you based on all sorts of factors. You must be alert enough to not be fooled, and here are a few things that we have summarized." Sitting in the back, Leonard listened with a smile and great attentiveness. His target for revenge was a high-sequence beyander. Sesimer paused for 2 seconds and continued, "In the first case, some high-sequence beyander will pretend to be hidden existences, using promises and hope to deceive you into reciting his corresponding description. In the second case, some high-sequence beyonders might be restrained in a sealed state. They will act as mystical items that can help you get out of your predicament. For example, a magic lamp that can grant you 3 wishes or a wishing pond. The third case is for a high-sequence potion named Parasite. They often claim that they have lost their bodies and can only survive together with your spirit body. They can only rely on you and will not harm you. They will then give you knowledge, formulas, and all sorts of benefits, hoping that you can become powerful so that you can one day help him reconstruct his body or take revenge. In reality, the beyonders with parasites will only become nutrients for the parasite, thus prolonging the parasite's lifespan and condition." As Leonard listened, his smile faded. The Cathedral of Serenity looked particularly beautiful at night. It complemented with the crimson moon high up in the sky that coldly illuminated the land. Leonard entered his single room, took off his 2 red gloves, and tossed them onto a wooden table. With a grim look, he sat in front of the patterned glass window, his back facing out as he bathed in the moonlight. After 10 seconds of silence, he said softly, almost gritting his teeth, "So you're a parasite." Leonard's voice echoed faintly in his own ears, muffled by obvious anger, tension, a sense of loss, and fear. In the blink of an eye, a slightly aged voice resounded in his mind. "You can say that. What exactly do you want? Are you a being that's leeching my life through your parasitic means? Or are you waiting for me to become stronger, so you can directly devour my beyander characteristic, just like cultivating a humanoid potion?" Leonard's voice was suppressed, but in no way slow. The slightly aged voice in his mind laughed. "I'm your fortuitous encounter. Didn't you always think so? You believe yourself to be unique and the protagonist of this era. In fact, you aren't acting as arrogant and self-conceited as you usually do. Ultimately, you're wary of me. Hee hee. After I taught you the acting method, you didn't even focus on studying it. All you did was a very superficial attempt at it. You wasted a very long time before you digested it and even hid it. You didn't pursue the nightmare potion. It was only after you met with the spawn of the true creator and suffered a setback were you willing to advance to sequence 7. Your regret has made you hallucinate. Leonard, think about it carefully. Would I not understand the Church of the Evernight Goddess? When I dealt with them, even the so-called Channies hadn't even been born yet. Would I not know that the Church of the Evernight Goddess knows of parasites? Would I not realize that the Red Gloves would grasp certain secrets to prevent the infiltration of high-sequence beyonders? But did I ever stop you from joining the Red Gloves? After a few brief changes in expression, Leonard finally fell silent, saying nothing. The voice in his mind laughed again. "Do you feel like you have aged faster than your real age? No, right? I can live for at least another 100 years. I'm not in a hurry to take over my host's life. As for your beyander characteristics, humph. We aren't even in a similar pathway that allows exchanging. If I swallow it, it would be equivalent to drinking poison, making me half crazy and increasing my chance of losing control. Do you think that I would do that? Evernight is grouped with Giant and Death, while my beyander pathway's goal is that of the Apprentice and Seer." Leonard looked at his body which was illuminated by the crimson moonlight. After some thought, he asked again, "What exactly do you want to do? What is your purpose?" The slightly aged voice in his mind sighed. "Didn't I already tell you? I've suffered tremendous damage, and I need a host to recover slowly, and I have to hide from a terrible enemy. The Nighthawks, the Church of the Evernight Goddess, is quite a good choice for a host. Leonard lifted his head, looked at the ceiling for a few seconds, and said in a deep voice, "Will you be discovered by the archbishops, high-ranking deacons, or other sealed artifacts?" The slightly aged voice replied leisurely, "If parasites were so easily discovered, that high-ranking deacon named Sesamer wouldn't have just given a warning and not send all of you to be checked. Of course, parasites do leave traces. The Church of the Evernight Goddess has the means to determine this, but it's relatively complicated and troublesome. It will cause certain losses and substantial danger. It might even affect that goddess, so before you become a high-ranking deacon, making you qualified to participate in meetings for the upper echelons of the Church, and interact with Grade 0 sealed artifacts, there's no need to worry. By then, I should have recovered and embarked on my own journey." Leonard listened with a serious expression. After a while, he said, "You have a terrifying enemy? Who is he?" The slightly aged voice chuckled and said, "I don't know his name, but I do know his last name." "What is it?" Leonard asked. The slightly aged voice suddenly became low and deep. "Amen. Ellipsis. The area south of the bridge, 46 River Bay Avenue." The owners of the house that were enjoying their dinner heard the tinkling of the doorbell. The only maid came to the door, and through the peephole above the door's lock, she saw a policeman in a black and white checkered uniform. She opened the door and asked somewhat fearfully, "Sir, is there anything I can do for you?" The cop was none other than the disguised Klein, who was attempting to take the initiative to perform. He was here to confirm that the partners of the vampire, Emlyn White, the ones living at 48 River Bay Avenue, and the people who entrusted Stewart with the mission, were law-abiding monsters. Yes, law-abiding monsters. Although this doesn't sound right and sounds a little funny, it's how I would react with my true thoughts. Klein emphasized in his heart. The police uniform he wore wasn't a fake that he specially tailored. It was a product of his ordinary clothes and hallucinatory effects. A magician had to do what a magician would do. Klein didn't monitor 48 River Bay Avenue because he believed that Emlyn White's companions had long since moved away. As monsters and non-humans, moving to another residence was the most basic thing to do after a comrade disappears for several days. They had to suspect that Emlyn White was captured by the Nighthawks, the mandated Punishers, or other official Beyonder organizations, and it was necessary to assume that he might be dead at any moment. Therefore, what Klein wanted to do was to perform an investigation by conducting a survey. He maintained the arrogance of a low-ranking policeman towards an ordinary citizen. Without taking off his hat, he slightly raised his chin and said, "I have something to ask your master." The maid entered in a fluster and quickly brought back a man in his 30s wearing a thick shirt. "Officer, what would you like to ask me?" the man asked nervously. Klein stood at the door and looked inside. "Do you know the residents of Unit 48? "I do." The male owner was stunned for a moment before asking, "What happened to them?" "They're involved in a case." "You have to tell me everything you know," Klein said with a straight face. His face was also disguised, augmented with slight hallucinatory effects. It was to ensure that he looked distinct from the great detective Sherlock Moriarty. The male owner suddenly came to a realization. It's no wonder they moved away so hurriedly more than a month ago. Most of the residents of River Bay Avenue and the neighborhood knew the Whites and their son. He was a handsome but eccentric young man. Mr. White is an excellent physician and is good at using all kinds of medicine and bloodletting therapy. Bloodletting therapy? Klein returned with a question. Yes, although this has been regarded by many newspapers and magazines as an old medical skill that had no effect, anyone who received Mr. White's treatment were cured. However, Mr. White also said that except for him, the other doctors who practice bloodletting therapy are quacks. The owner gave his viewpoint. The bloodletting therapy is to accumulate food for themselves, isn't it? The only thing that is useful was the medicine. This vampire family relied on bloodletting therapy to help treat patients while receiving food as compensation. If there weren't many patients, or if their blood was very unhealthy, would they consider going to a distant hospital to steal blood from a blood bag and drink it? For such monsters, they really are law-abiding. Klein nodded in understanding. The emotional color changes in his spirit vision told him that the man wasn't lying. Seeing that the police officer didn't refute him, the man continued, "Mr. White and his wife are very nice people. Although they can't cure those who are seriously ill, they're still pretty good doctors for all the residents who live nearby." Was their child, Emlyn, involved in a case? That young man was too silent, as though he looked down on us. "He's always hiding at home, and I have no idea what he's doing." "Officer, are you hot? It's so cold outside. He probably just hides in the day and comes out at night." Klein wiped the sweat off his forehead and said, I've been walking around here all day because of this case. Next, according to his design survey, he learned everything about the Whites and their son. One family at a time, he knocked on the door, asked questions, compiled answers, and came to the conclusion that the White family was indeed kind, amiable, and law-abiding. It doesn't seem like a description of a vampire. Klein looked up at the crimson moon which was piercing through the clouds, ready to make a final confirmation. He removed the hallucinatory effect from his body and started divining. After making sure there was no danger, he went around to the side and climbed into the house at 48 River Bay Avenue. Others might not know who had taken Emlyn White away, ultimately afraid of being followed up by an official visit from official beyonders, but Klein knew what was going on and wasn't worried about a trap. As he entered the second floor, he used the moonlight to see that the rooms were in disarray. Many things hadn't been taken away. Through these things, he could imagine the haste in which their owners had left. He even found some precious books on herbs in a study, including some popular countryside folk recipes. As he walked, Klein entered one of the bedrooms, and shadows came into view. He jumped in fright, imagining that he had been ambushed. He almost snapped his fingers to light the match that had been thrown outside. Fortunately, no attacks occurred. The crimson moonlight shone through the window, covering the entire room. Klein was finally able to clearly see what those black shadows were. They didn't have any spiritual luster, and they were figurines of varying sizes. The biggest one was only slightly shorter than Klein. It was a girl wearing a gorgeous long skirt. Her sleeves and collars were covered with lace and ribbons. This female figurine was obviously more like one of wax. Her facial features were vivid and lifelike, and her golden hair and red eyes were alluring and beautiful. The smallest one was only the size of a normal person's palm. It was a woman wearing silver body armor. She looked valiant and heroic while looking magnanimous and beautiful. As his eyes swept past each figurine, Klein suddenly remembered something. Under the influence of Roussel, the development of figurine art had two trends. One was the adorable type, allowing them to have a change of clothes, while the other strove to be more realistic. Klein looked around and couldn't help but exclaim, "These figurines are not cheap." Don't tell me Emlyn is a vampire who is obsessed with figurines. After a thorough inspection, Klein confirmed that there was nothing odd about the White family and that the couple didn't even leave a single strand of hair behind, apparently to prevent anyone from tracking them down using divination. He returned to the bedroom filled with dolls, took 4 steps counterclockwise, and went above the grey fog, intending to use divination for a final confirmation. However, before he got down to business, he conjured the female figurine who was nearly his height, and just like how he had done a divination for the mutated sun sacred emblem in Tingen City, he picked up a dark red fountain pen and wrote a sentence on the yellowish-brown goatskin, its origin. Putting down the pen and holding onto the piece of paper, Klein leaned back in his chair and began to mumble as he slowly adjusted his mental state into a cogitation state. After repeating this 7 times, his eyes turned dark, and his eyelids drooped as he entered a deep slumber. In the gray space, he saw the puppet craftsman working with extraordinary concentration. He saw the red-eyed girl being placed in the room of dolls and Emlyn White fishing out his wallet with his eyes fixed on her. Finally, the scene stopped inside the bedroom where Klein was presently located. The proud vampire, Emlyn White, with his hair combed back diagonally, looked handsome but slightly delicate. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the doll affectionately, along with all the other puppets of different sizes. He truly is a fanatic of figurines. Klein opened his eyes and facepalmed. Soon after, he waved his hand, causing the puppet that he conjured to vanish from the space above the grey fog. When he was done, he picked up his fountain pen again and wrote another divination statement. Scenes of death in the last 10 years in 48 River Bay Avenue. According to the statements from the residents, the White family had been there for no more than 10 years, so Klein was able to lock onto a specific area, and he believed that if the White family were just superficially good monsters who were actually making disappearance cases all the time in order to suck warm, delicious blood, then it was impossible to not have any happen at home. In a period as long as 10 years, there would always be a few accidents as long as they didn't stop. After carefully checking the divination sentence, Klein recited it and entered cogitation again, rapidly falling into a dream. In the dusky world, his vision was sometimes pitch black, sometimes dotted with snowflakes, and sometimes splintered. However, no scenes appeared. This was the result of the divination. Nothing. No one had died in the last 10 years at 48 River Bay Avenue. By taking into account all the factors involved, it's possible to make a preliminary conclusion that the White family was a law-abiding vampire family, other than a few instances of petty theft. As Klein looked at the long, mottled bronze table in front of him, he wrapped himself with his spirituality and plummeted into the gray fog. Returning to the real world, he carefully removed the traces he had left behind and left 48 Riverbay Avenue. Instead of making his final conclusion, he took a detour to the Riverbay police station, where he easily sneaked into the archives by mixing himself in among the thieves and drunkards, allowing them to serve as a foil for his disguise. There, he boldly lit the gas lamps inside. Then, Klein pulled out the last 10 years of missing persons records and paged through them. From time to time, the police officers on duty would pass by the door, but their eyes didn't notice any light leaking out from the archives. There's nothing suspicious at all. After an unknown period of time, the black-gloved Klein placed the docket back. Then, he turned off the gas lamp, took off his hat in the darkness, pressed his hand to his chest, and bowed towards the lobby. On his way back to Minsk Street, Klein took a shower, changed his clothes, sat down at his desk, and spread out the map of Backland that he had first bought on the steam locomotive. The first thing he did was find Rose Street, which was on the south side of the bridge where the Harvest Church was located. This was where Father Utravsky was the bishop of the cathedral and had Emlyn White imprisoned in his basement. Soon after, Klein's gaze moved as he familiarized himself with the names and layout of the surrounding streets. A performance can't be done too hastily or with an excessive thirst for success. One has to slowly immerse the audience into the act. Klein whispered, unfolding a piece of paper and lowering his pen. Dear Detective Stewart, I wonder if you've found Emlyn White? I've been keeping an eye out for you lately, and one of my informants told me today that he has seen this man on Tuteva Street in the area south of the bridge. Of course, he simply said that the person he saw looked similar to the man in the portrait. Ellipsis. Putting down the pen, Klein folded the letter neatly, stuffed it into an envelope, and affixed a black stamp worth 1 penny. Above the vast, boundless Sonia Sea with undulating waves churning beneath it. The Blue Avenger advanced forward steadily without any signs of shaking. Alger Wilson sat in the captain's cabin with a brass sextant in his hand, but his eyes were closed. Without a sound, a smile suddenly appeared on his face. I've finally digested it. Alger opened his eyes and raised his hands, causing the surroundings to glow with an azure light. The azure lights intersected and turned into a huge wave that swept forward. Alger pressed his hands together, and the wave disintegrated, turning into countless raindrops that fell onto the deck. After nearly 4 months, his seafarer potion had finally been digested. During this period of time, not only had he spent a long time wandering the seas, completing all the missions assigned to him by the Church, but he had also deliberately sought out new sea routes and sought out undiscovered islands. After a few setbacks, he was finally met with success. This, in turn, led to the digestion of the potion, allowing him to figure out his principles as a seafarer. The core principle involved being intimate with the sea, to masterfully grasp information regarding sea routes and the weather, as well as exploration and discovery. The always heavy Alger couldn't help getting out of his seat. He paced back and forth in the captain's cabin, thinking of the future he longed for. After obtaining the potion formula for the Wind Blessed and finding the corresponding Beyonder ingredients, he would hide his advancement to Sequence 6 from the Church. Then, he would repeat the same process again, striving to become a Sequence 5 ocean songster within 3 years. During this process, he had to serve as the captain of the Blue Avenger and avoid entering the mandated Punishers with its complicated social relationship so as to prevent his secret from being exposed. Once I'm promoted to Sequence 5 and gain sufficient strength, I'll be able to secretly return to that place. Alger subconsciously looked to his right. His gaze seemed to pierce through the planks of the ship and the vast sea, and onto an ancient and hidden island. Alger wasn't worried about his future advancement within the Church. Once he fulfilled his wishes, he would be able to fully focus on seeking a higher position in the Church. At that time, he would continue to disguise himself as a Sequence 7 despite being a Sequence 5 and drink another Wind-Blessed potion. This would increase his Beyonder characteristics, strengthen him, and slow his digestion, but it wouldn't endanger his own safety. For the same reason, after Sequence 5 was completely digested, he could imbibe another ocean songster and repeat the normal process. This would only push him closer to losing control, but he also had solutions to that. It was to find a woman to marry and transfer the extra Beyonder characteristics to his children. After doing this, I'll be able to move closer to the level of a cardinal and approach the level of a high sequence Beyonder. This is my chance in such an era. In his mind, Alger had already sketched out the image of himself wearing the robe of a cardinal as he occupied a high position in the church and had many mandated punishers under his control. After being intoxicated for a moment, he withdrew his gaze and regained his senses. What follows will increase in difficulty with each step. Fortunately, I have the tarot gathering and Mr. Fool. Although there are dangers underlying it as well, any path to improving myself will involve risk. I have to try to gather those Russell diary pages as quickly as possible. I should grab the chance to raise a question and understand what that card beside Mr. Fool's hand is. The one which only shows its back. It wasn't there previously. Card, Russell's diary. Could it be the item I'm thinking of? Alger's eyes narrowed as his pupils constricted. 15 Minsk Street. Klein yawned, switched off the gas lamp, and slipped into bed. He originally had another plan. He had wanted to use divination to grasp the origin of the biological poison bottle and obtain the first 3 potion formulas for the sequence from the werewolf Beander characteristic. But after a busy night dealing with the matter regarding Emlyn White, he felt a little tired and decided to try again the next day above the grey fog. Just as he lay down and closed his eyes, Klein suddenly felt that something was wrong. This was the spiritual intuition of a seer. It has already been several days since I obtained the werewolf Beander characteristics and the biological poison bottle. It's not like I haven't been in a good mental state during this period of time. Yet, I have been repeatedly delaying the divination. This is very abnormal. Klein sat up, carefully thought about it, and recalled a similar incident. The first time he met Megos, he had wanted to directly use his spirit vision to observe her mental state, but he naturally ended up missing the opportunity due to momentarily being taken aback. It was only at the end that he found out that it was because Megos had an evil god spawn in her stomach. His spiritual intuition as a seer had stopped him without leaving a mark, preventing him from losing control and collapsing right on the spot. It's very similar, and this time, it's even more obvious. I remember that Miss Sharon mentioned that the Rose School of Thought's control over their members far exceeds my imagination. Everyone's body and soul seem to be bound by something, which is also the reason why information regarding the mutant sequence is rarely leaked out. They believe in the chained god. So, when using the Beander characteristic of a werewolf to deduce the corresponding potion formulas, it would directly involve this evil god and bring about consequences that I don't wish to bear? Klein thought about it seriously and felt that there was something suspicious about it. Back when I divined the mutated sun sacred emblem and the ear left behind by the listener, my spiritual intuition hadn't stopped me. Could it be that the chained god is stronger than the eternal blazing sun and the true creator? Or could it be that his nature allows him to restrain the grey fog and even be able to effectively invade it? Of course, the source of the danger can also be the biological poison bottle. Thinking of this, Klein, who was always cautious, decided to attempt divining the biological poison bottle tomorrow and see if his seer's spiritual intuition would stop him. Tuesday morning, the weather remained as cold as it usually was this season. Klein tightened the collar of his tweed coat, put on his hat, and pulled open the door. He was heading to the end of the street, where the mailbox was, to post a letter to Detective Stewart. Since it wasn't that far, there was no need to dress neatly or heavily, but Klein had just recovered from his cold, so he had wrapped himself up thickly just in case. Perhaps it was because of the strong wind last night, but the air in Backland was surprisingly good. Klein subconsciously slowed down his pace and enjoyed this rare morning. As he passed Jurgen's house, he heard the oriel window creak open and instinctively turned to look. Standing at the window was Mrs. Doris, wearing a black plush hat and a thick grayish-blue scarf. She looked even worse than before, and her body was even more hunched. "Good morning, Detective Moriarty. Thank you for taking care of Brody. He said you were a good man, didn't you, Brody?" Old Granny Doris bent down and picked up the black cat with green eyes. Brody used all 4 of his limbs and struggled in her embrace. Finally, he jumped down and lightly landed on the windowsill. But instead of leaving, he circled around and around, nuzzling Mrs. Doris with its head on one side, without even looking at Klein. Was he being friend-zoned by a cat? Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh and smiled sincerely. "It's a happy deed, and even more delightful news is that you've recovered and have been discharged from the hospital." After exchanging a few pleasantries, he said goodbye and continued to walk down the street with a smile on his face. He had only taken a few steps when he heard Mrs. Doris call after him, "When Jurgen comes back, I'll have him pay you. Do I look like I took this mission for the money?" The smile on Klein's face suddenly froze. He could only half turn around and wave his hand, indicating that he understood. When he was far away from Jurgen's house, his expression gradually turned serious, and he sighed faintly. He had just activated his spirit vision to look at Mrs. Doris's aura and found that her situation wasn't too good. It wasn't only because of her old age but also because of the cold weather and bad air in Backlund. All of these had a very bad effect on her lung disease. Mrs. Doris should be able to make it through this late autumn and winter, but it will be hard to say for the next one, or the next one. If she wants to live for a few more years, she would have to move to the south, to the area around Daisy Bay. It's a pity that it's likely that lawyer Jurgen can't afford to do so now. Even I haven't been to Daisy Bay. Klein mumbled, came to the mailbox, and stuffed the letter in. This was the prelude to his performance. And this evening, he would head to the Harvest Church as a detective and do the rest of the preparations. After buying a daisy pie for breakfast, Klein returned via his original path and was quite at ease. Before he got close to the house, he saw an elegantly decorated carriage parked outside. Two ladies in black hats and a ribbon were anxiously pulling on his doorbell, while the maids and bodyguards were scattered around, as though they were on guard against something. Mrs. Stellan, Ma'am Mary, do they have something to entrust me with? They look very anxious. With the paper bag containing the daisy pie in hand, Klein approached and said with a laugh, "Ladies, it should be time for breakfast." When they turned back to see Detective Sherlock Moriarty, Ma'am Mary was visibly relieved. "Mr. Detective, you have to help me." In Klein's spirit vision, there was nothing fake about her anxiety, nervousness, and fear. Therefore, he nodded his head, pointed at the door and said, "Let's talk inside." As he spoke, he glanced at his landlady, Stellan, and he noticed that her condition was entirely different from the past 2 days. She had become very low and dejected, as though she wasn't interested in anything at all. What happened to her? Although his landlady liked to show off a little, she's someone who loves life a lot. Klein took out his key and opened the door. After entering, before she could sit still, Ma'am Mary impatiently said, "Detective Moriarty, I received a threatening letter." "Threatening letter?" Klein put down the daisy pie, clasped his hands and asked, "What does the letter say?" Ma'am Mary glanced sideways at Mrs. Stellan, and seeing that she wasn't quite as active as usual, she said after some deliberation, "That letter asked me to handle the smoke of the factory impartially when I carry out the atmospheric pollution investigation and to acknowledge their contributions, or else I would end up like the doll that came with the letter. The doll's head was ripped off, and its arms and legs were broken." Ma'am Mary seemed to recall the feeling when she opened the letter, and she said with a trembling voice, "This is the first time I've encountered something like this. I don't know if it will become a reality or not. I didn't know that I would have to experience such cases when I became a member of the Investigation Council. I didn't know, ma'am. Perhaps Emperor Russell once said that there are only two ultimate forms of hatred between people. One is to murder the other person's parents, and the other is to destroy another person's means of earning money." Klein solemnly nodded his head and said, "My suggestion is to report it to the police." From his point of view, Ma'am Mary was now a member of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council. Her status was completely different from before, and the police would certainly not take the threats she received lightly. Moreover, this involved the development of a governmental policy and wasn't an ordinary matter, so there was a high probability that the police department would hand the case over to the church's Beander organization in order to solve this case as soon as possible. Based on Ma'am Mary's status as a follower of the goddess, the Nighthawks was an inevitable choice. This way, even if Klein wanted a share of the reward, he didn't want to involve himself in it. "I've already done so, but it doesn't reassure me." Ma'am Mary pursed her lips and said, "Do you know what they said?" "They said that threatening letters were formed by cutting the words from newspapers, and the doll could be bought from anywhere. It would be very difficult to find the sender in a short period of time. And they only sent one policeman to protect me. Goddess, is this how they treat a helpless citizen's cry for help?" Ma'am Mary paused, looked earnestly at Klein and said, "Detective Moriarty, I believe you can help me, not only because of your performance from that matter but also because of Mike's approval, Aaron's praise, and Talam's extolment. And I know you made a great contribution in that serial murder case. Don't worry, I will pay you well enough. Your words make me happy, but something doesn't seem right. Unless the police have already been bribed, they would probably transfer the case to the Nighthawks, and with Beander means such as divination available, it would be impossible for a letter made up of words from a newspaper to avoid detection. The sender would have either been caught already, or they would have means to interfere with divination. The latter would only lead to a formal and large-scale intervention by the Nighthawks. No matter what the situation is, it will be different from how the situation is handled now. Klein didn't answer Ma'am Mary right away, but he carefully analyzed the abnormality of this matter. The living room suddenly became unusually quiet. The feeling of silence made Ma'am Mary and Mrs. Stellan somewhat uneasy for some unknown reason. At some point in time, Klein had fished out a coin and made it bounce and roll between his fingers, as though it were a habit of his to focus his thoughts. Suddenly, the coin flew up and then fell down steadily onto the palm of his hand, its back facing up. Klein was surprised. He was divining whether this matter involved danger, but it turned out to have none. If such a threat really exists, even if the sender doesn't have considerable abilities, it would still result in a certain degree of danger. It's impossible to have none. Is it just a simple threat? Or, Klein suddenly thought of another possibility as he smiled and said, "Ma'am Mary, don't worry. You can go back home in peace. If someone comes to you in the next 2 days to discuss this issue so as to make it public, allowing the citizens to know the true intentions of those factory owners in order to incite anger among the public, then you will be fine." The possibility which Klein had just thought of was that the threat was a trap set up by the council so as to incite the public to use their anger, allowing the atmospheric pollution investigation to be carried out smoothly and lead to the subsequent bill which could benefit them. This would explain why the police are responding in this manner. "Why do you say that?" Ma'am Mary asked, frowning. Klein smiled and replied, "That's what I've deduced. And if what you claim doesn't happen in 2 days?" Ma'am Mary pressed. Klein said sincerely, "Then I will provide protection. In any case, there's no danger," he added inwardly. After comforting and sending off Ma'am Mary, he went above the grey fog to confirm the matter and received the same result as before. By then, his daisy pie had turned cold. Ma'am Mary returned home with some apprehension and uneasiness, wondering if she should invite Stellan to stay with her for a few days. At that moment, her housekeeper informed her that the eldest son of Count Hall, the chief secretary of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council, Mr. Hibbert Hall, had come. After both of them entered the living room, before Ma'am Mary could even open her mouth to speak, the handsome, blonde gentleman spoke first. "Ma'am Mary, I've heard of what has happened to you. It's a disgrace to Backland, and even to the whole kingdom, and I'm deeply sorry for it. Don't worry, everyone in the committee will stand with you. Thank you for your concern," Ma'am Mary responded gratefully. After a moment of consideration, Hibbert Hall said, "Ma'am, I wish to get a reporter to interview you regarding this incident. I want to tell everyone about what happened to you and how despicable this act is. I want to let everyone see how outrageous those people who have contaminated Backland's air are. There's no sign of repentance. Please agree to my request." It's exactly as Detective Moriarty described. Ma'am Mary was momentarily at a loss for words. After breakfast, Klein rested for a while. Since he had nothing better to do, he went above the grey fog in preparation to divine the origin of the biological poison bottle. This time, he didn't delay it at all. The stone pillars of the ancient and majestic palace supported the high dome. Klein sat at the end of the long bronze table, holding a translucent brown bottle. He checked it over and over again, but he didn't sense any danger from it. "Let's begin." He conjured a pen and paper and wrote the divination statement, its origin. Putting the fountain pen away and bracing himself for a blow, Klein glanced at the paper and the biological poison bottle, leaned back in his chair, and entered cogitation while reciting the statement. Soon, he entered a hazy grey dream world and saw a dark but spacious room. There were king cobras, black widows, and other strange plants and animals in the room. It was a messy and harrowing scene. A middle-aged man in a white coat was standing in front of a long table in the middle of the room. He threw the snake gall and spider venom into the huge black pot that hung from the ceiling. In the end, he even put in a few items that possessed a strong spiritual luster. For example, they would sometimes disperse into a black gas, and other times condense into dark green lung-shaped objects. Otherwise, they would be in the form of a tube containing a clear azure liquid or fiery red eyes. The air around the black iron pot gradually became viscous. It was gathering towards the center, but it was constantly being pushed aside, making it difficult to achieve its goal. When the white-robed middle-aged man saw this scene, his brow slowly creased, his expression looked slightly anxious. He flipped through the black notebook by his side, gritted his teeth, and used a ritual silver dagger to slice open his wrist. Drops of fresh blood dripped into the black iron pot, seemingly breathing life into its contents instantly. A terrifying suction force suddenly erupted, sucking in all the viscous air around it. the scarlet blood which had yet to leave his wrist was fully sucked into it. And that wasn't everything. Regardless of how the white-robed middle-aged man struggled to resist, or how he revealed a terrified expression, he couldn't prevent his body from approaching the iron pot. His body was stretched, his head was compressed, and amidst his screams, he was eaten, little by little, by the pot. The hanging specimens, plants, and anything that could move or be moved, all flew into the pot. Brown fog suddenly filled the room, quietly ebbing and flowing. By the time it was all over, the room was empty except for the brown, translucent bottle lying quietly in the middle of the clearing. Ellipsis. The scene quickly faded away, and the dream world shattered. Klein opened his eyes and muttered to himself, so the biological poison bottle is a product of a death-seeking experiment. I thought it was a Beyander characteristic left behind by some Beyander. If that were the case, I'd have been able to divine a formula. To Klein, a rampager's spirituality and Beyander characteristic, as well as a spirituality and Beyander characteristic which was contaminated by an evil god, could all be used to divine a formula. Just like the all-black eye which Nimblewright Master Rosago left behind. It was thanks to the isolation effects of the grey fog, and how the mysterious space was able to eliminate negative influences, giving him the ability to court death. Of course, a Beyander characteristic involved many other additional factors. In theory, the chances of failure were extremely high, but Klein only had the confidence to do so after advancing to magician. Similarly, a sealed artifact formed by Beyander characteristics could also be used to divine the formula for a potion. However, if they were mainly ingredients, then through the production processes and dangerous experiments done by an artisan or other Beyanders, turning them into mystical items, then Klein's divination would be useless at his current state. Even with the enhancement effect provided by the mysterious space above the grey fog, it was useless. Not bad. At least I don't have to worry about the biological poison bottle having any other latent risks anymore. Klein glanced at the werewolf fang and wisely abandoned his curiosity. In Empress Borough, the opulent villa of Count Hall, Audrey continued her study of psychology. By her feet, the huge golden retriever, Susie, was sitting there, her eyes shining. From time to time, she wagged her tail, as if enjoying the scene. Psychiatrist Escalante finished the introduction material and deliberately made a casual remark. Actually, there is such a theory. It's believed that humans would inherit a certain amount of their ancestors' consciousness over the generations, thus, forming the underlying logic of one's behavior patterns. For example, although many people have never seen a poisonous snake, they would instinctively feel afraid and wish to avoid it once they encounter one. Why is that? This is theorized to be an instinct that we inherited from our ancestors, something that is hidden in the deepest recesses of our consciousness. In ancient times, people constantly fought with poisonous snakes and all kinds of ferocious animals, and they gradually carved this memory into their consciousness and passed it down. How does it get passed down? Audrey asked with interest. Escalante, with her long hair which reached her waist, laughed. That's a very good question. Some people provide explanations that involve a theory that everyone's consciousness is actually connected at the lowest level. It is one entity, and the traces and characteristics left behind on this entity will affect the consciousness that belongs solely to them. For example, the lowest level of consciousness is like an endless ocean. Our unique consciousness would be the islands situated in the ocean and can be split into two parts. One is hidden under the water, which is the subconscious, which is higher in both quantity and size. The other is exposed on the surface of the ocean, the superficial consciousness that can usually be detected. This is the axiom of this school of thought in psychology. Audrey glanced at Susie, stroked the golden fur on its neck and said, "So, we can use this connected ocean to influence the consciousness of others and achieve the goal of curing certain mental illnesses? This is the mysticism foundation and Beyander powers of a psychiatrist? But it doesn't seem enough and is lacking something. For example, the sky above one's head, the sky which shrouds everything." Audrey curiously thought as she wore a look of confused enlightenment. "You're really talented in this area," Escalante praised in delight. "However, we can only affect a portion of the surrounding ocean, and through it, we can affect those who are close to us. If we venture deeper into the ocean, it will be easy for us to lose ourselves." She looked up at the ornate and complicated clock on the wall, smiled, and said, "Time's up. This is the end of today's class. Miss Audrey, if you're interested in this psychological school of thought, then we can continue talking about it next time." "All right." Audrey stood up and bowed. Watching Escalante leave, she nodded and thought, "Ma'am Escalante doesn't seem like a real psychiatrist. At most, she's like me, a telepathist." Was what she just talked about the axioms of the psychology alchemists? They really are patient. Why aren't they trying to recruit me yet? As Audrey was in thought, Susie commented happily from the side, Audrey, I feel like she's the same type of person as us. No, I mean the same type of dog. No, that's not right. Woof. Susie, who only had a rudimentary grasp of the human language, fell into a state of confusion, unable to find the right words to describe her feelings. South of the bridge, Rose Street, outside the Harvest Church. Klein, in his normal disguise, looked up at the sacred emblem of life on the facade, held his cane, climbed the steps, and stepped through the main door. The first thing he had to do was to confirm the situation. Only by doing this could he perform better so as to ingeniously rescue the vampire, Emlyn White, without garnering suspicion. Then, as a detective who had provided clues, he could receive the gratitude from the White family and gain the applause of an audience. It was bound to be an interesting performance. The Harvest Church wasn't big, as it only had a prayer hall. Klein found a spot by the aisle and looked ahead as he took off his hat. Bishop Utravsky was preaching. His height of more than 2.2 meters, and his burly physique, which couldn't be concealed by his loose priest robes, gave off an extreme sense of oppression. However, his expression was one of extreme gentleness, filled with appreciation and gratitude towards life. In front of such a priest, no one dared to cause a ruckus. The few believers quietly listened, occasionally making prayer gestures unique to the Church of Mother Earth. Klein watched carefully, waiting patiently, neither conceited nor rash. As the sermon ended, he gripped his cane and prepared to get up to proceed with his subsequent plans. At this moment, a man wearing the priest robes of the Church of Mother Earth entered from the door that led to the room at the back of the cathedral. He looked 28 or 29 years old, had black hair and red eyes, possessing a high nose and thin lips. He was handsome but didn't give off masculine vibes. He was none other than Emlyn White. Klein's mouth gaped a little and nearly failed to close it. Isn't this guy supposed to be locked up in the basement? Wasn't he shouting about how determined he was, that he would absolutely not submit to Bishop Utravsky's will? Emlyn White distributed the communion to one believer after another, and he finally stopped in front of Klein. Klein's mind whirred, and he immediately in a low voice, Are you Emlyn White? Your parents entrusted my friend to look for you. Why are you here? Did you encounter something? Are you in need of assistance? Emlyn White didn't seem to have his unique pride and said with a smile that only looked slightly better than crying, There's no need. I will be returning home soon. He pursed his lips, shook his head, and forced a smile, saying, I am already a believer of Mother Earth, no, a priest. This answer was completely out of Klein's expectations. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond, and he could only shout repeatedly in his mind, Hey, you were very adamant about your worship of the moon the last time we interacted at the Harvest Church. You said that you would absolutely not convert to believing in Mother Earth. How long has it been, and you have already given in? Isn't that way too fast? What about your persistence? Where's your moral integrity? My carefully prepared performance has been forced to end before it has even begun. This is just taking me by surprise. Klein opened his mouth and suddenly realized something amiss. Why is Emlyn White informing me of his conversion? I'm just a detective who accidentally chanced upon him while passing by. Does he wish for me to pass this message to his parents? Is there another meaning behind this? While Klein was guessing, Emlyn White put away his worried and smiled smugly. You don't have to act, Mr. Detective. Or should I call you the new owner of the master key? Hee, to a noble sanguine, everyone has a different smell and has different blood characteristics. Even when I was locked up in the basement, I could smell it. I remember your smell. I've been recognized. Klein instantly fell into shock as he nearly entered combat mode. Even if he didn't use his spirit vision, he could tell from Emlyn White's tone and words that he wasn't lying. He was very confident and certain. Just as the tense feelings rose in him, Klein suddenly thought of something. Why should I worry about that? Then, he answered his own question in his mind, so what if I was recognized? The current situation is different from what it was 2 months ago. I was left flustered by the incident with Ambassador Bakerland in front of the official Beyonders. I was rushing around, trying to grasp at every possible straw. In the process, I ended up making contact with Beyonder circles, and even the possibility of me becoming a Beyonder was quite plausible. Therefore, even if my identity as a Beyonder was exposed, they wouldn't think too deeply about it and dig up my past. And it's very likely that Detective Isengard Stanton is a Beyonder, and he maintains good relations with the police and the official Beyonder organizations. He had speculated that I was the same as him and tried to gently rope me in. In this regard, I can barely be counted as a borderline member of the official Beyonders, and if anything were to happen, I wouldn't necessarily be imprisoned. More importantly, I have already made my current image so deeply ingrained that I don't have to worry about any wanted posters. If anything goes wrong, then I can just abandon 15 Minsk Street and my identity as Sherlock Moriarty. So, what's there to worry about? Yes, before I came here, I had also performed a divination, and the revelation was that there was almost no danger. As these thoughts flashed across his mind, Klein's contracted pupils, slightly appalled expression, and his fight-or-flight state eased, as if he was discussing the day's weather with Emlyn White. Seeing his calm expression, Emlyn White raised his eyebrows, took a few steps to the side, and squeezed past him before slowly sitting to his side. The vampire looked at Bishop Yutravsky, who was leading the believers in the rite of Holy Communion, and he said with a sneer, "Mr. Detective, aren't you afraid that I'll go to the police station and shout out loud that you're a Beyander?" Similarly, Klein looked forward and said without turning his head, "I'll go with you and shout out loud that there's a vampire. Come on, let's have an internecine outcome. Do you think I'm afraid of you?" Emlyn White's expression stiffened. He raised his right index finger and said, "Sanguine, a noble sanguine." Got it? Before Klein could speak, seeing that Bishop Yutravsky was preoccupied with the rites of Holy Communion, Emlyn White chuckled and said, "Regardless, I'm finally going to be free." I pretended to submit and told the old man that I was willing to convert to believing in Mother Earth and was deeply penitent for what I had done. Although I have no idea what was necessary to show repentance, it's not a problem to put on an act. That old man actually believed me like this, and he was very happy as well. He let me out on the spot, and he let me become a priest here. He told me that as long as I memorized the Holy Bible of the Church of Mother Earth, he would allow me to return home. Ha ha, that old fogey, who's all brawn and has become silly from his faith, sure is easy to fool. Easy to fool? Klein turned his head to look at the vampire. Looking smug, he looked forward and said, "Father Yutravsky used to be a pirate. He probably killed far more people than the number of people your father has ever saved. Furthermore, most pirates don't trust their fellow crew members. Betrayal and trickery are common among them. To be a relatively successful pirate able to live to the end, Father Yutravsky wouldn't be a person who's easily fooled, even if he's not a bright person." Emlyn White wore a look of disbelief as he wished to retort. Klein rubbed the top of his cane and leisurely added, "Father has a powerful sealed artifact in his possession. It is known as the mental terror candle. It can allow the wielder to enter the deepest recesses of the target's soul. There, no one can lie. Moreover, this is only one of its uses. I don't know if it has any other abilities." Emlyn gradually froze, his eyes losing focus. After a dozen seconds, he whispered with a pale expression, "When I said I was willing to change my faith, that old man came in with a lantern. There was a candle in the lantern, and I didn't get a good look at it." Klein tilted his head and gave Emlyn White a sympathetic glance. "Perhaps Father Yutravsky used it to plant a seed in you, one that gradually and thoroughly makes you wholeheartedly believe in Mother Earth." The corner of Emlyn's mouth twitched, revealing a smile comparable to a zombie's. "I don't feel anything at all. It shouldn't be anything like you said. Besides, aren't my parents coming? They can blame the priest through ordinary people, saying that he forcefully detained me, forcing him to make a choice between sullying the Church of Mother Earth's reputation and letting me go. Isn't that a great idea?" Klein maintained his look of pity, clasped his hands, and raised them to his nose, acting truly penitent. "If I were Father Yutravsky, I would choose to call the police and have them determine the truth. Tell me, who do you think will suffer in the end, the bishop who has the right to preach or a vampire? Sanguine, sanguine." Emlyn White's facial muscles seemed to twitch. He clenched his fist and punched the back of the pew in front of him. "I can wait. Once I memorize the Holy Bible, I will ask the old man to let me return. He is a truly devout person and will not break his promise." Klein didn't turn his head and said with a smile, "I've been to 48 Riverbay Avenue. Your parents have already moved away. Naturally. Not only will they move away, they will also move to somewhere I'm not aware of," Emlyn White responded without hesitation. Klein added with a relatively relaxed tone, "They moved in a hurry. They left a lot of things behind, such as the things in your room." Emlyn White's expression suddenly became extremely wonderful. He gaped his mouth, abruptly stood up, squeezed past Klein, and rushed towards Bishop Yutravsky, who stood in front of the sacred emblem of life. "Father, Bishop, I want to return home. I want to return home. I want to return home." Emlyn shouted. Seeing that there were still believers who hadn't finished their Holy Communion yet, Father Yutravsky didn't respond. He merely gave the pitiful vampire a calm look. Emlyn quickly shut his mouth and became quiet. He paced back and forth, looking extremely anxious. Smiling, Klein stood up, took his cane and hat, and strolled down the aisle to the front pew of the cathedral's hall. When Holy Communion was over, he walked up to Father Yutravsky and said with a serious expression, "Bishop, I don't know why you're retaining Emlyn here, nor do I want to know. I only know one thing, his parents have entrusted me to take him back. If this giant-like priest agrees to my request so easily, I can only light a vigil candle for this vampire, Emlyn. No, I'm sure he will hate candles from this day forth. It's best to mourn for him," Klein secretly thought. Father Yutravsky looked down at them and replied gently, "Emlyn can return home at any time." Klein gave Emlyn White a glance, raised his right hand, and tapped his chest. He wanted to gesture the sign of the crimson moon by tapping in a clockwise fashion, but in the end, he forced himself to draw the triangular sacred emblem. Emlyn became rather anxious from the look Klein gave him. Without a word, he rushed to the door of the cathedral and left without a hitch. Klein followed him at a moderate pace without any signs of anxiety. After proceeding forward in what appeared like a jog, Emlyn suddenly slowed down and said in a daze, "I feel like I'm starting to miss the Harvest Church, the feeling of memorizing the Holy Bible, and the sacred emblem of life. I wish to return to clean and tidy the place. It'll only take an hour. This planted seed is even more vicious than I had imagined. No matter where this vampire goes, he will return to the Harvest Church every day and work for an hour? That's actually quite all right. At the very least, the seed, which was planted, didn't change Emlyn's faith. In a way, he's showing him some respect, but why did I use the word respect? That candle is called Mental Terror Candle, and it's said to be from a dragon. The spectator pathway is rather scary." Klein tapped his cane and said, "Do you need me to remind you of anything?" "There's no need." Emlyn's expression distorted as he angrily said, "I will fight this feeling. I'm going to move to Midseashire or Fasak. I don't believe that I'd still wish to return when I've left Backland." He gritted his teeth and suddenly exhaled. "Let's take the carriage back to Riverbay Avenue." "All right," Klein responded nonchalantly. After a few steps, Emlyn stopped a rental carriage. Just as he was about to board the carriage, his back stiffened for 2 seconds. Then, he said so quietly that Klein could barely hear him, "I don't have any money on me." "I do." Klein smiled. Emlyn stopped talking and got onto the carriage. Klein sat across him, and as the carriage began to move off, he asked, as if in thought, "Your father is a doctor? One that possesses outstanding skills in drugs and medicine?" Although he was listless, Emlyn raised his chin out of habit. "This is the gift that we Sanguine enjoy. The most outstanding potion masters are all from the Sanguine." "Is that so?" Klein whispered to himself, his thoughts a mystery. Emlyn said after a moment of silence, "Write to your friend and tell him that I have returned to Riverbay Avenue. My parents will come looking for me." "All right," Klein answered simply. After nearly 20 minutes, the carriage pulled into Riverbay Avenue and stopped in front of Unit 48. After paying the fare, Klein got out of the carriage and saw Emlyn White look towards the bedroom, his expression becoming abnormally excited. Restraining himself, the vampire pressed his hand to his chest and bowed deeply at Klein. "In any case, I must thank you." Klein immediately revealed a smile. "There's no need to thank me. The bounty reward of finding you and the transportation fees will be obtained from your parents. Also, you have to concoct a medicine with Beyonder effects to help me treat a patient. This is the reward that your family should pay. Bounty reward, transportation fees, and medicine with Beyonder effects." Emlyn White was left momentarily dazed when he first heard that. This was not the answer that he had expected. "What about your gentlemanliness?" The vampire thought in shock. "As a detective, abiding by clear accounting principles is necessary. Besides, you've even delayed my visit to the Quelaag Club. I don't know what food they've offered in limited supply for the past 2 days." Klein looked at Emlyn White as he joked and lampooned silently. After a few seconds, Emlyn forced a smile and said, "I have to see the patient before I can concoct the appropriate medicine." "From your tone, you sound really confident." Klein nodded thoughtfully. He then thought of a problem. The White family seems to be a family of outstanding potion scholars. If I were to really be injured and poisoned, then I can come to them for treatment. Wouldn't all of my efforts of going out of my way to get the apothecary formula from Father Yutravsky be for naught? I no longer need to nurture another aid that's good at healing. Reality sure does change faster than a plan. However, it's not really a waste either. I've already made back my investment from Miss Magician. For things like formulas, as long as it exists, it will always be valuable. Besides, the White family will definitely stay away from River Bay Avenue and live their lives with new secret identities. I might not be able to find them, so it's not that convenient. No, before the mental terror candles inducing thoughts are resolved, all I need to do is wait for Emlyn White at the Harvest Church. With this in mind, Klein took off his hat, bowed and said, "No problem, I will take you there when the time comes. I shall not waste your time any further." "Cheerio." Emlyn White's expression changed as he hesitantly said, "If you can remove the effect of the mental terror candle, then you will receive a greater bounty, and—" He paused and raised his chin. "And the friendship of the sanguine. I'm a magician, and I possess the sunbrooch and biological poison bottle. I'm only limited to mediumship when it comes to the aspect of one's psyche, so what can I do? Amongst the people I know, only Miss Justice is a close match, but she's only a sequence 8 telepathist. Unless you change your faith to the fool that doesn't belong to this era, then we will be able to find out how to use the knowledge recorded in the Book of Secrets to help you solve this problem through a corresponding ritual." Speaking of which, vampires seem to be worshippers of the primitive moon, very similar to the Shaman King and the like. Could the ancient god recorded in the City of Silver, the vampire ancestor, Lilith, be the primitive moon? Klein said with a smile as his thoughts wandered, "I'll keep a lookout for ways to help you." Emlyn White nodded and didn't say anything else. He impatiently turned around and rushed to the door. If it wasn't for the fact that the carriage driver was still nearby, he would have spread his black bat wings and soared directly to the second floor. Klein laughed and shook his head emotively. He rode back in the same rental carriage and arrived at the steam metro not far away. He then made a transfer and returned to Sherwood Burroughs 15 Minsk Street. Before entering the room, Klein, who had become accustomed to opening the letterbox, checked for letters. To his surprise, there really was a letter. There was no stamp on the letter. It was addressed to Detective Sherlock Moriarty and was signed off with Jurgen Cooper. Lawyer Jurgen? Puzzled, Klein picked up the envelope and tore it open. Under the light of the street lamp, he saw a piece of paper and 2 bills. The denominations of these 2 notes were 1 soldi and 5 soldi. A total of 6 soldi. I fed the cat 3 times during the period. The agreement was 2 soldi per instance. Realizing the reason, Klein opened the door and lit the gas lamp. As he unfolded the letter, he discovered that it didn't contain much, and the words that Jurgen had handwritten were as precise and serious as he was. "Dear Detective Moriarty, thank you for taking care of Brody over the past few days. This is the reward you deserve. I rang the doorbell twice and found that you weren't at home, so I could only put the payment in an envelope and put it in your letterbox. As I might not be able to come back until tomorrow evening, I might miss the verbal agreement which my grandmother promised, tonight. As a lawyer, I value the validity of verbal agreements and hope that they will be carried out strictly. Finally, thank you once again. Jurgen Cooper." Mr. Lawyer, your gratitude is so dry and boring that it's even inferior to Brody's, but the explanation for your behavior is very detailed. It really fits the Jurgen style. Also, why place it in my mailbox? If this were Earth, in the time before I transmigrated, I might not even look at the mailbox downstairs for months." Klein smiled as he folded the bills and placed them in his pocket. Then, he took out a sheet of paper and wrote to Detective Stewart. After writing the beginning pleasantries, he wrote after some deliberation, "I found Emlyn White at the Harvest Church near Tuteva Street. It's a very small cathedral belonging to the Church of Mother Earth. It isn't very common in Lowen. Emlyn White claimed that it was because of certain matters that he chose to run away from home. Afterwards, he was taken in by the bishop of the Harvest Church and stayed there, becoming a—" Klein thought for a moment before writing down the word, volunteer. Then he added simply, "Thanks to my persuasion, he has returned to 48 River Bay Avenue. However, he might visit the Harvest Church often for volunteer work." When he was done, Klein read through it, then he put down the pen and neatly folded the letter. He rummaged around for an envelope, but he didn't affix the corresponding stamp. He planned to hire someone to deliver it directly to Stewart's house the next day. If he were to go through the kingdom's postal system, even if he were to put the letter in the mailbox now, he wouldn't be able to get it taken away by the postman until tomorrow, and then there would be the process of sorting and delivering it. So, although he was also in the royal capital of Backland, Stewart would have to wait at least until the day after next before seeing the letter. Only then would the Whites be notified. And during this period of time, Emlyn White was a penniless guy with only his figurines. This is also for the sake of receiving payment early. Klein chuckled, tidied up the coffee table, and returned to the second floor to brush his teeth and take a bath. On Wednesday morning, after spending 2 soldi and entrusting a rental carriage driver to deliver the letter, Klein bought some of the main ingredients for Desi seafood rice, intending to cook fried rice today. He couldn't help but swallow a mouthful of saliva when he thought of the pearly white rice. After spending some time, he finally cooked a pot of fragrant fried rice with bacon and black tea after going through all sorts of hassles in the kitchen. It was so delicious that tears almost filled his eyes. This is truly a moving and nostalgic taste. After eating 2 large plates of fried rice, Klein sat down on the chair and rubbed his belly. As Emlyn White's situation had too many twists and turns, his performance had already ended before it had even really begun, and he couldn't achieve the desired goal. Thus, he could only look for another opportunity to take the initiative for a performance. However, Klein still benefited from this. Failure was also an experience, and it made him understand at least one thing. Unlike ordinary magicians, my performance not only has aides, but it also has enemies and participants. Their reactions and choices can similarly affect its development. I have to consider all of these elements ahead of time. This is also a lesson. It's better to be taught a lesson over such a trivial matter than to be schooled when facing important matters. Klein looked at the empty plate in front of him and contemplated about what other performances he could initiate. After a moment of serious consideration, he realized that there weren't any. Of course, it wasn't absolute. They were just unsuitable for him to do them now. For example, Klein had always wanted to take care of that evil spirit in the 4th epic ruins of the Tudor dynasty. But even if it was Sharon, who had the scarlet lunar corona, and Marich, who had obtained the Rampager Beyander characteristic of a wraith, Klein didn't think that they were able to fight against the high-sequence monster. It was even possible to end up dead before even knowing why. Taking the initiative to perform isn't equivalent to courting death. It's not about using one's life to perform. Klein warned himself. There was something else he wanted to do, but he didn't think there was much a chance. It was to find the strange child, Will Ossepton, who had brought bad luck to the surgeon, Aaron. Klein had always been interested in the tarot card which the child possessed, and he wanted to confirm if it was a mystical item. Unfortunately, this case had already been taken over by the Nighthawks, and Klein didn't want to get involved with his former colleagues. I'll wait for Dr. Aaron's break time before heading to the Quelaag Club and asking about the progress, and then I'll decide what to do. Klein's thoughts quickly took shape. According to what he knew, Dr. Aaron was usually free on Friday afternoons and Sundays in which he would play tennis at the Quelaag Club. Klein had also confirmed one thing through today's Backland Morning Post. There would be a Beyander gathering tomorrow night organized by Eye of Wisdom. I can't sell the werewolf Beyander characteristic or the biological poison bottle for the time being. I can't even find someone to turn the former into a mystical item. The high-sequence Beyonders of the Rose School of Thought are definitely still active nearby, filled with rage. I bet they can't wait to find Sharon, Marich, and their helper before tearing them apart. He had to keep a low profile in this area for the time being. Klein picked up his napkin, wiped his mouth, and began to clear the table. He had wanted to rest for the day and go to the Quelaag Club for a leisurely day without taking the initiative to perform, but then he recalled the Aemon avatar which attempted to penetrate the grey fog, and he recalled the role that the Book of Secrets had played in that harrowing moment. So Klein lit the fireplace in the living room and brought the Book of Secrets back to the real world. He then concentrated on reading, studying, and taking notes. Of course, he would later burn the corresponding notes above the grey fog. It was already noon before he realized it when he suddenly heard the doorbell ring. After hiding the Book of Secrets, Klein entered the living room and went straight to the door. The visitor was the thin, bearded Detective Stewart. He looked at Klein with great reverence and excitement, and he couldn't wait to praise him. You really are a great detective with abundant resources and channels. You were actually able to solve this kind of case without any clues. Why do I feel a slight change in my spirituality? It seems like the potion has been digested a little more. In other words, my performance still enjoyed some limited success. However, there's only one person in the audience, and only he was fooled into seeing the wonderful outcome. An audience's applause really is effective. Klein was startled before he revealed a warm smile. No, it's just good luck. God was watching over me. Klein modestly stepped aside and invited Stewart in. What he said was the truth, and this matter did involve good luck. Long before Stewart had accepted the mission, he already knew of Emlyn White's whereabouts. Stewart shivered as he took off his coat and hat and hung them on a rack in the hall. The darn weather is getting colder. Perhaps I should try using those coats with cotton stuffed inside them, he said. You can't call this cold, right? If you go to the north of Midseashire and live in Winter County for a day, you'll understand what truly low temperatures and true winter are like. Klein chuckled. Then, he generously asked, a cup of hot coffee? I would love one. Stuart followed him to the activity room on the first floor. I've been to North Midseashire, and I know about the cold and the snow there. It was a nice vacation, but Backlands cold isn't inferior either. It went through my clothes like magic and seeped into my bones. Oh, what a wonderful fireplace. Stuart stood in front of the burning fireplace for 20 seconds before he sat down on the sofa. He looked at Klein, who was busy brewing instant coffee, and he said, I'm going south for a holiday to go fishing at Daisy Bay for New Year's. What about you? Do you have any vacation plans? We put up with Backlands Air for a year and work hard to save money, all for such a holiday. Perhaps I should head to Daisy Bay as well, Klein said hesitantly. He turned his head to the side of Stuart's face, and for a moment, he seemed to be in a trance. This involved an agreement. An appointment with his elder brother, Benson, and sister, Melissa. Haha, I'll show you my fishing skills when the time comes. Stuart continued without end, we still aren't rich enough. Otherwise I'd like to travel to Fasak, Intis, and even to the southern continent. After he finished making the coffee, Klein handed the man a white porcelain cup. He took 2 steps back and sat down across from him. Holding the cup in his hand, Stuart took 2 deep breaths of the fragrant and warm steam. After resting for a few seconds, he put the cup down and said very formally, according to our agreement, I'll share the reward I received this time with you. The Whites gave a total of £50, and you obviously did more than I did. Sherlock, how about £30? I still have to pay my informants for their work. Only £50? A vampire is only worth £50? Klein couldn't help but silently lampoon. But he also knew that it wasn't that the Whites didn't want to increase the bounty. It was because they were worried about giving too much money and scaring the detectives into making unnecessary associations, attracting the attention of the police or some official Beyonder organization. To the average private detective, a £50 mission was already tempting enough, and Klein had only used £7 back then to hire detectives to investigate all the red chimney houses in the whole of Tingan City and the towns along its outskirts. In addition, the Whites gave you an extra £1, claiming it's for your transportation expenses for the past few days. Looking somewhat puzzled, Stuart produced 6 £5 notes and 1 £1 note. Klein reached out to take them, casually checked their authenticity and didn't explain the transportation fees. Stuart didn't ask any further questions and instead said with a smile, apart from Mr. Stanton, you're the best detective I've ever met. Did you join this profession midway, or have you studied under a great detective prior to this? What great detective have I studied under? There's quite a number. There's Sherlock Holmes, Hercule Poirot, the forever elementary school student less than sup greater than 1 less than, sup greater than, and that guy who swindles others in the name of his grandfather less than sup greater than 2 less than, sup greater than. Klein silently lampooned. He thought and said, I come from Midseashire, and I did various jobs before I became a detective. That's why you're so rich in knowledge and experience. Stuart said in enlightenment. Hey, I'm a bit embarrassed by your flattery. Klein smiled but didn't respond. Stuart took a sip of his coffee and said, Sherlock, I hope you can provide me with help in the future if I encounter a difficult case that I'm unable to solve. My social connections in the detective circles have widened. Klein replied cautiously, if I have the time when the time comes. After some idle conversation, Stuart tactfully offered to take his leave, and Klein accompanied him to the door. After putting on his coat and hat, Stuart was about to open the door and leave when he suddenly turned around and sincerely said, Sherlock, you live too simply. Your talent deserves better coffee. Ah? Klein was stunned for a moment, but then he immediately felt a bit embarrassed. He laughed dryly and said, I can't tell the quality of the coffee. It's all the same to me. Ellipsis. After sending Stuart off, Klein went to the butcher's to buy a few ox bones and some beef. He went to the vegetable shop to buy some ingredients such as white radish, rounding up all the required condiments. He wanted to prepare beef bone radish soup for dinner and eat it with the leftover rice. As for noon, he found a random restaurant on the streets and ate a small serving of lamb chop. After a leisurely afternoon, Klein continued to study the Book of Secrets, and the more he read, the more he realized that he knew little about mysticism. Fortunately, he had a solid foundation. He quickly grasped many things once he came into contact with them and pondered over them. In the evening, he smelled the tantalizing fragrance of the beef bone soup, and his Adam's apple bobbed up and down twice. He heard the doorbell again, as though it was a bugle to signal dinner time. Gulping down his saliva, Klein walked behind the door and reached for the handle. The image of the visitor naturally appeared in his mind. It was the handsome but not masculine red-eyed vampire, Emlyn White. There's no need to rush him at all. What a man of his word. Klein opened the door and smiled. Good evening, Mr. White. Emlyn raised his chin, letting his impatience show in his expression. He was about to say something when Klein looked at his brown clerical robes and said with a knowing smile, You just came over from the Harvest Church. Who was the one who said he could resist last night? Unable to maintain his gentlemanly demeanor, Emlyn gritted his teeth and said, That old man, that old man. Damn it, how do I get rid of this inducing suggestion? Before Klein could reply, he patted the clothes on his chest and said with a stern face, Take me to the patient. There's a good dinner waiting for me. As he spoke, he sniffed indiscernibly, as if he had smelled something. Klein picked up his coat and hat without saying another word. All right, I'll take you there now. After closing the door and taking a few steps, he cautiously asked, Do you have a certificate to practice medicine? How else am I supposed to convince lawyer Jurgen to allow Mrs. Doris to take the medicine? Emlyn looked up at the sky at a 45-degree angle and said, I don't need those papers to prove my abilities. Before Klein frowned, he casually added, It's too simple. I obtained it easily by going through the process. Ellipsis. This tone makes it sound like he's rather proud of receiving a certificate for practicing medicine. Klein smiled without a word. Looking at the wet ground in front of him, Emlyn casually said, Do you know what I like most about Backland? What? Klein responded without any curiosity. Emlyn chuckled and said, The persistent gloomy sky with fog that blots out the sun. This allows me to go out during the day without feeling too much discomfort. It's great, except for the air. In other words, the sun really would deal certain damage to vampires? Fortunately, I thought of this yesterday and didn't bring the sun brooch with me. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to communicate with Emlyn. Klein seemed to gain an understanding. As they conversed, they had already arrived outside the Jurgens, and Klein went up to ring the doorbell. After a while, the door opened, and Mrs. Doris, who was dressed thickly at home, said with pleasant surprise, Mr. Detective, I wasn't expecting you. Brody the black cat crouched to the side, looking at Emlyn warily, as though it felt that something was amiss about him. Klein pointed to the vampire beside him. I became acquainted with a doctor who's good at treating lung diseases, so I've asked him to come and give you a checkup. Let me do the introductions. This is Dr. Emlyn White. Is that so? You still actually remembered this? What a good child. Doris happily invited the two inside. Child? Klein's mouth twitched, but he didn't say anything in the end. On the way into the living room, Emlyn whispered, The patient's problems are irreversible. She's very old and rather weak. Even if I give her the medicine, she would only be able to live through this winter. She would pass away in 3 to 5 years. Unless she's given an immortal potion or the like as spoken in the legends, that's all that can be done. Or should I turn her into a sanguine? But at her age, she can no longer endure the changes a Beander characteristic can do to her body. Furthermore, my parents and I don't have any excess characteristics left. Irreversible? Klein was startled and silently sighed. He said to Emlyn, Make her the medicine first. We'll leave that to after the winter. All right, I have a type of ready-made medicine with me that's suitable for this kind of situation. Emlyn didn't stand on ceremony as he sat down on the sofa. At that moment, lawyer Jurgen was walking out of the kitchen as he took off his apron. He asked Klein about the purpose of his visit. Dr. White, what do you think of my grandmother's lung disease? Jurgen asked seriously. Emlyn was obviously very experienced in such situations. He first explained the ins and outs of lung disease, and after most of it flew past Jurgen's head, he said, What she needs most is warm and healthy air. That's my most sincere advice. In addition, I have special medicine that she can take for free. As he spoke, he took out his certificate in a small metal bottle. Will there be any side effects? Jurgen asked cautiously. No, the only problem is that it can't cure the root of the problem completely. It's just a temporary cure, Emlyn replied in a very professional manner. If it weren't for Detective Moriarty, I wouldn't let anyone try it. Perhaps I can give it a try? Cough. Mrs. Doris interrupted. Jurgen glanced at Klein who, having performed a divination prior to this, nodded affirmatively. All right, Jurgen finally made his decision. He watched warily as Mrs. Doris drank the bottle of medicine and carefully observed her reaction. There wasn't much change to Mrs. Doris at first, but she gradually began to feel her breathing lighten. She stood up and bent down to pick up the cat. She happily said, "I feel much better." Seeing this scene, Jurgen's usually stoic face had his lips curl up slightly. However, Klein was thinking about the 3 to 5 years. He curled a smile and sighed to himself. This can also be considered a type of magic show, I guess. Using Beyonder powers to create fake outcomes to make the audience happy. After waiting for more than half an hour and confirming that nothing unexpected had happened, Klein and Emlyn White left lawyer Jurgen's house and proceeded in silence, each of them preoccupied with their own thoughts. Soon, they arrived outside 15 Minsk Street. The vampire, Emlyn White, put his fist to his mouth, coughed lightly, and said, "The payment has been paid. I hope we won't meet again in the future." "That sounds pretty cool, but Mr. White, have you forgotten something important?" Klein smiled politely. "I will visit Bishop Utravsky every now and then, and I hope you will not be at the Harvest Church when the time comes. That way, I don't have to busy myself with finding a way to solve the inducing suggestion planted in your psyche." Emlyn White's expression suddenly became very strange. He stayed silent for 2 seconds before he raised his chin and said, "We have many powerful mysticologists among the sanguine. I will write to them for help." After he finished speaking, he pressed his hand to his chest and bowed to bid farewell. Turning around and taking a few steps, he suddenly slowed down, turned his head, and asked hesitantly, "What were you cooking over here?" "Beef bone radish soup, with rice and chili peppers from the Fanapotter Highlands," Klein said in anticipation as he breathed in the fragrance drifting out from the house. Emlyn frowned and shook his head. "Chili peppers aren't things fancied by the sanguine. Frankly speaking, it's hard for me to imagine a vampire eating chili peppers. Of course, I occasionally imagine a vampire holding a steamed bun and chewing on garlic and onions." Klein silently lampooned, pointed to the door, and indicated that he was about to enjoy his dinner. Emlyn White thought for a second, lowered his voice, and said in deliberation, "Last night, I thought over things for a long time and found out that you actually didn't do anything, so why are you asking for compensation? That old man would have let me leave at any moment." Klein chuckled. "No, that's not how the accounts are done. Your parents assigned a mission to find you, not to save you. In the end, I found you. According to the agreement, the reward should belong to me. Besides, if I hadn't reminded you, you might have stayed in Harvest Church for weeks or months before you realized that you were free to leave. Furthermore, you wouldn't have noticed the seed planted in your mind." "Are you hinting that my intelligence isn't up to par?" Emlyn's face twisted. "No, I'm saying it directly." Klein smiled but didn't say anything else. He just opened the door and went straight to the kitchen, his mind full of the clear and alluring soup, the white rice, the soft yet chewy beef, the marrow hidden deep in the bones, the sweet, refreshing radishes with meaty flavors, and the shredded chili from the Fanapotter Highlands. In the spicy hot shreds, there were also pink rose salt and green parsley leaves. On Thursday morning, as promised, Klein went to the Value for Money coffee shop in East Borough. Old Kohler, who was still wearing the same thick jacket as before, was sitting in a corner, matching tea that barely tasted like tea with a loaf of black bread. Klein came in front of him, took out the things he had prepared long ago, and pushed them towards him. It was payment consisting of 2 5-soldi notes, 4 1-soldi notes, and a handful of copper pennies specially designed to increase the effect of the payment. Old Kohler stared straight at them for quite a while before finally reaching out his right hand to take them with a tremble. He looked at the money over and over again, raised his hand to wipe his eyes, and squeezed out a smile. "At the dock, we carry the heavy goods and do some troublesome cleaning with our feet in the cold and dirty water, only for 1 soldi a day. And there was a total of 15 soldi here." Klein listened in silence. A few seconds later, he said, "What have you heard recently? What did you notice?" Old Kohler put away his payment, took another sip of his tea, pinched the corners of his eyes and said, "I've met a lot of dockworkers, and I've reconnected with friends I used to know when I was a tramp. Some of them have found employment in factories, and some of them have been switching between the workhouse and the parks. Hey, just like how I was in the past. Recently, there has been a rumor from who knows where that since we believe in one of the 7 gods, why don't we directly pray to the creator of everything? It's said that he didn't truly pass away, and he remains in everyone's body and in all things. Praying to him will result in our redemption. Not only will we enter his kingdom after death, but we will also have a better life before death. For example, we don't need to work so hard, and we can have butter and oily meat every day. Is this some theory the Aurora Order has spread about the fallen creator? After what happened to Lenivas, they've begun to pay attention to the poor in East Borough, the dock area, and the factory district, hoping to use them for certain purposes? I wonder if the three churches have noticed this. They probably have. Klein tucked a piece of butter between two slices of toast and took a bite without knowing what to expect. Old Kohler went on for a while before saying, "Mr. Detective, according to your instructions, I paid attention to the female textile workers. In the end, with the help of the police, their struggles failed, but, the leaders became the factory's supervisors, and a third of them lost their jobs. Some of them are actively looking for new jobs, some have become street girls, and some have gone off somewhere. The entire East Borough is in chaos. If this was the situation when Rear Admiral Hurricane Kilongos came to Backland, he could come to East Borough to kill 1 or 2 people every day without anyone discovering or noticing the act." Klein sighed in his heart. Old Kohler continued to recount what he saw and heard daily before saying, "By the way, Liv's youngest daughter has gone missing." Liv? Klein was certain that he had never heard of the name. Old Kohler then said in realization, "She's the laundry maid you and Mr. Reporter met last time. The one who was arguing with someone. She was always at home doing the washing with her 2 daughters, but yesterday, when her 2 daughters were returning home from delivering the laundry, one of them ended up missing. The younger one, what a pity. She's been a widow for years, and she has always been counting on her 2 daughters, and now. Sigh, the police in East Borough definitely won't look too hard for her. Unlucky people tend to meet with even worse situations because they have no ability to resist danger or change their environment." This phrase suddenly flashed through Klein's mind. After a few seconds of stone-like silence, he said, "Take me to see them. I'm a detective, so maybe I can help them find her." "They have no money," Old Kohler reminded him. Klein picked up his hat and cane and said, "I occasionally do volunteer work too." Ellipsis. Sherwood Borough, in the apartment which the 2 ladies originally rented. Zio had resumed her life as a bounty hunter, and Furs hastened the pace of her new book, hoping to save the money needed for the Beyonder ingredients required by the Trickmaster potion. But writing a book wasn't something one could write that easily. Furs scratched her hair irritably and decided to go out for a walk to seek out inspiration. As she walked, she found that she had unknowingly returned to a familiar place. Diagonally ahead of her was the Yosifov Clinic, a fairly large private clinic where she had first worked. After staring at it for a while, Furs thought of the old lady who had guided her into the Beyonder world. She turned into a small alley on the right and took a shortcut to a nearby street. The 2 sides of the street had leaves fluttering down the parasol tree. It was a relatively quiet place. Furs remembered that the old lady lived at Unit 39. Back then, she would occasionally visit personally to deliver medicine, give injections, or even to help with the daily chores. It's almost been 3 years. That place should have been rented out again. There might have been several changes in tenants. I still remember when I came to tidy up the items she left behind. I discovered many notebooks about mysticism. Furs walked under the nearly barren parasol tree and slowly approached Unit 39. As she recalled her past experiences, she gradually gained some inspiration for writing. At that moment, she saw an old man in a heavy woolen coat and a black half-top hat standing in front of Unit 39. He had rung the bell 3 times. After a few minutes, seeing that no one was opening the door, the old man with blue eyes shook his head and turned around. He whispered in puzzlement, "Still no one." He suddenly noticed Furs, who was looking at him from nearby. He hurriedly walked over, gently and urgently smiled, and said, "Beautiful lady, do you live in this district? Do you know Laubero and Alisa? Alisa? Isn't that the old lady's name? There haven't been any tenants in this house lately?" After some deliberation, Furs said, "I don't know if the Mrs. Alisa I know is the one you're looking for. She lived here for a long time, but she passed away 3 years ago." "Passed away 3 years ago? What about Laubero?" The old man with wrinkles at the corners of his eyes hurriedly asked. "Her husband passed away even earlier than she did," Furs answered honestly. The elder was momentarily stunned before revealing a sorrowful expression. After a moment of silence, he said, "Thank you, good lady. I am the elder brother of Laubero, and I've been living in Midseashire all this time. As I haven't received any letters from them for a long time, I decided to come and pay them a visit. Can you tell me what happened to them in the past few years?" Mrs. Alisa's husband's elder brother. Could he be a descendant of the family she spoke of? Furs suddenly snapped to her senses and replied with a smile, "No problem." She quickly thought through what she could and couldn't say. The elder pointed behind him and said, "There's quite a nice coffee shop over there." Ellipsis. Klein once again stepped into the humid room of a slightly old apartment in East Borough. He saw the woman who had quarreled with the street girl last time over her contempt towards her profession. She was standing in a pile of clothes. Her wrinkled face had lost a lot of its spirit, she lost her laborious drive, and she looked lifeless. As for her eldest daughter, the 17 to 18-year-old girl who was sitting by the bed and washing clothes, she kept sobbing. It's all my fault. I didn't watch over her properly. I shouldn't have taken her into the secluded alley. She even said that she was going to learn a few more words at the free school tonight. It's my fault, it's all my fault. Liv suddenly regained her senses and turned to look at her eldest daughter. She wiped away her sad expression and berated her fiercely. What are you crying for? Get up and wash the clothes. Do you want to starve? Do you plan on not even being able to attend the free school? After screaming, she saw Klein and Old Kohler at the door. Old Kohler, this is? She asked doubtfully. Old Kohler seemed to be slightly afraid of her ferocity as he subconsciously took a step back. Liv, this is a detective, and he wishes to help you find Daisy. Liv's wrinkled, peeling face turned to Klein and said coldly, we've already made a police report. Although she was perhaps in her 30s, she looked to be in her 50s. Klein looked around the room where many wet clothes hung. He vaguely remembered the last time he was here. There had been a 13 or 14-year-old girl, carefully holding a crude homemade iron to iron the clothes which had wrinkled from being hung to dry. Her hands had been covered with burns. She's the missing Daisy. Klein looked back at the laundrymaid, Liv, and said in a neutral tone, do you believe that the East Borough Police will really be looking for Daisy? Are you sure the people who caused Daisy to go missing wouldn't cast their sights on your family? Do you wish to lose another daughter after losing one? When the cruel yet heart-wrenching words reached Liv's ears, the indifferent expression on her face slowly crumbled. She turned agape, but she couldn't say anything. The corners of her eyes gradually turned red. She abruptly lowered her head and muttered to herself in pain and despair, I don't have any money. The room suddenly became silent. Even the sobbing girl didn't make another sound. Klein pursed his lips and let out a silent sigh. I occasionally do volunteer work, simply to help others. Heh, I haven't done so in a long time, so please give me a chance. Volunteer work? Liv lifted her head and ruminated over the phrase. Klein nodded slightly and answered, the job will be done pro bono. No, it is not completely free either. Kindness will bring me great satisfaction. Since you have no other solutions, why not give it a try? Liv was silent for a moment. She raised her hand, which had wrinkled from being soaked in water for an extended period of time, wiped her eyes, and said in a low voice, Mr. Detective, you really are a kind and good gentleman. Her voice suddenly became choked with sobs. This was what happened. At midday before yesterday, at noon, Daisy delivered a load of washed laundry under Freya's lead. It was just outside East Borough, and they needed to cross several streets. In order to rush back for lunch, Freya had chosen a secluded alley, but a momentary distraction left her realizing that Daisy, who had been following her, was gone. She retraced her route but never found Daisy, and Daisy hasn't come back yet. Where did this happen, Freya? The girl named Freya had already stood up, her eyes were red and puffy. She sobbed and said, right here in Broken Axe Lane, Mr. Detective. Will Daisy be all right? Probably, Klein replied without much an expression. He looked around and asked, do you have anything that Daisy often carries? I can borrow a police dog. It has an excellent sense of smell and can be used to find a person based on the lingering scent. Number, Liv thought for a moment and said with a sad expression. Freya once again shed tears. She felt as if the situation had turned into one of despair once again. Suddenly, she blinked and said, wait, there's something. Daisy's vocabulary book. Vocabulary book? Old Kohler asked. Liv sniffed and said, I make Freya and Daisy attend the free school at night. I can keep washing clothes, but they can't always be doing the same. This lady is such a good mother. Klein couldn't help but sigh. The free classes offered at night were set up by the 3 major churches or some charity organizations. From 8 to 10 o'clock in the evening, the school would be free of charge and would even provide stationery and a certain amount of paper. It was an education that was need-blind, and it would at most involve some religious knowledge. Klein had heard old Neil mention that he had once been a teacher for the Church of the Evernight Goddess for several years. Because there were very few people who volunteered to be teachers in the free school, a unique teaching method was established. Teachers would arrive early, gather the few students who had the best academic progress, imbue them with the content for that day's class, and then put them in charge of teaching the different classes. The teachers would supervise, correcting any mistakes. It was called a tutorial system. Corresponding to the free classes were the free organizations such as the Technical Workers' Workshop, which were truly accessible to the poor, and one of the few outlets to escape from poverty. Unfortunately, there were too few similar organizations, and it was difficult for them to play a substantial role. At this moment, the sobbing Freya added, Daisy liked studying very much. She was made the tutor of her class by her teacher. She would put together the vocabulary words she had copied and hugged them in her bed every day. She would wake up early and go out into the street to recite them under the light of dawn. She's always found it regretful that there are no street lamps around here. As she spoke, Freya rushed back to the bunk bed and took out a stack of crumpled paper from under the tattered pillow. Due to it being in a humid environment for extended periods of time, the words that were copied on it had already smudged. The edges of the sheets of paper were worn out, as though they had been turned over and over by someone for a long time. Mr. Detective, is this okay? Freya handed Klein the so-called vocabulary book, which had no binding at all, and anxiously asked. Yes, Klein answered very simply. He wasn't trying to comfort Freya. Although it wasn't the kind of items Daisy carried around all the time, it was something that had accompanied her all this while. Moreover, it had been projected with Daisy's strong will. It was excellent for using it as dowsing to seek her out. He casually flipped through the vocabulary book and said, Then I'll start taking action. The earlier I find Daisy, the better. Liv and Freya were unable to find words to describe their feelings. All they could do was watch as Klein and Old Kohler leave, repeating the words, thank you, Mr. Detective, and, thank you, good gentleman. After leaving the apartment, Klein turned to Old Kohler and said, You should pay attention to those female textile workers who lost their jobs, especially those who have neither found new jobs nor become street girls, and pay more attention to those who have gone off to unknown places. Pay attention to your own safety. Ask less and listen more. If you do this well, you'll get a bonus. All right. Old Kohler nodded heavily. He didn't immediately bid farewell. After hesitating for a moment, he asked with a tone full of expectation, You'll find Daisy, won't you, Mr. Detective? I can only say that I will do my best. Klein didn't make any guarantees. Old Kohler sighed and smiled bitterly. I've lost my child, so I'm very unwilling to see this sort of thing happen. He waved his hand and walked towards another street. Klein left the area at a leisurely pace, wrapping Daisy's vocabulary book around the head of the cane and, without attracting any attention, completed a dowsing rod seeking. There are results. Towards the northwest. For the time being, it's not possible to confirm if I'm suffering any interference or misdirection. He looked down at the direction in which the cane was going to fall and put out his palm to steady it. According to the revelation, Klein went all the way out of East Borough and hired a rental carriage. Half an hour later, the carriage, which occasionally changed directions, stopped at Iris Street, near Sherwood Borough and West Borough. It stopped in front of a house with a vast lawn, a wide garden, a small fountain square, and a marble statue. At this moment, Klein's cane had fallen down inside the carriage and was aimed straight at that direction. Through the window, Klein could see the guards patrolling inside the gates and ferocious dogs with their tongues out. The security inside was quite tight. More importantly, even without using divination, his spiritual intuition made him sense that there was great danger hidden within. What is this place? How can Daisy's disappearance involve such a dangerous place? Klein thought for a few seconds, then he told the carriage driver to keep going. The carriage driver replied with some surprise, Sir, are you not here to visit Mr. Capham? Capham? The name sounded extremely familiar to Klein. He smiled and asked, Why do you think so? There will always be people coming out from East Borough who ride in my carriage all the way here. Heh, this is the home of the rich and powerful Mr. Capham, the carriage driver casually replied. East Borough, Capham, tycoon? Klein suddenly remembered who Capham was. There were many rumors that he was the leader of a bloody criminal organization which was stained with blood. He was involved in the disappearance of many innocent girls. And in reality, he was a tycoon who knew quite a few important figures. Without another word, Klein leaned back against the wall and half closed his eyes. The horse carriage slowly moved forward. The luxurious villa was left behind as it disappeared from the window. In a small booth in a coffee shop. Furs already knew that the old man across her was called Lawrence Nord, who came from Midseashire's Constant City and was a public school teacher. He didn't know that Mrs. Alisa's husband was dead, nor that Mrs. Alisa had inherited his estate and become a Beander, much less know that Mrs. Alisa had left me her relics. Could he also be a Beander? Does he have the ability to divine? After taking a sip of Pharma coffee, she organized her words and said, I was a doctor at the nearby Yosifov clinic, and Mrs. Alisa came to see me often. That was when her husband, Mr. Laubero, had already passed away. Sometimes I would accompany her by chatting with her and helping her do things like, so in the end, she made a will, giving me her savings and cash. She donated jewelry, books, furniture, and other things to a charity. This was done under the supervision of her assigned law firm. Furs was telling the truth, but not the whole truth. Lawrence pinched his forehead and said, what a pity. I don't understand why Alisa didn't contact me over all those years. She didn't mention your name. She was vaguely dissatisfied with Mr. Laubero's family, Furs replied frankly. Lawrence fell silent for a moment before saying, thank you for informing me. It has made me understand certain things. By the way, where are Laubero and Alisa buried? Grimm Cemetery. Furs took out a pocket watch and gave it a look before saying, Mr. Lawrence, I still have things to tend to. I should be leaving. Lawrence didn't stop her. He got up and saw her off. After sitting down again, he rubbed his temples in distress and silently muttered to himself, Laubero is dead, and he didn't leave any children behind, and I don't know what Alisa did to his Beander characteristic. Richard died at the hands of the Aurora Order. Sam doesn't even wish to contact us at all, having no interest in shouldering the responsibility of the family name. Will the Abraham family slowly disappear like this? Lawrence sat in the coffee shop booth, unable to stop himself from thinking about the hardships of the Abraham family over the years. Ever since they had split up into smaller families and settled in other places, the Elder Council's control over the family members hit rock bottom. A great number of Abrahams refused to advance, in order to avoid the effects of the curse. Hence, many of them remained at sequence 8 or 9. Some didn't even attempt to become Beyonders, wishing to be ordinary people with a certain amount of knowledge so as to live a calm and peaceful life. The Elder Council believed that this was an act of forgetting the family's honor, but it couldn't be harsh on such actions since it was tantamount to self-destruction. In such a situation, the upper echelons of the Abraham family began to think of introducing changes. They imitated the teacher-apprentice inheritance system of the Life School of Thought, and they trained non-family members, hoping that once they advanced to become high-sequence Beyonders, then they would, in turn, be able to help the Abraham family deal with the curse that had existed for about 1,500 years and find their ancestor, Bethel Abraham, who had vanished in the War of the Four Emperors. The plan started off smoothly, and the apprentices who didn't have to worry about the curse quickly became stronger and stronger under the Abraham family's meticulous nurturing. Within a short period of 10 years, there were several strong sequence 5 individuals among them, while not a single person among the direct descendants of the Abraham family was sequence 6. The trunk was too weak, but the branches were too strong. Hence, the seeds of tragedy were planted, and the ambitious apprentices began casting their sights on the powerful sealed artifacts that the Abraham family possessed. Their plot failed, but it also resulted in serious repercussions. All the non-family members at sequences 6 and 5 were of the opinion that their positions within the Abraham family didn't match their own strength and that they couldn't be trusted, preventing them from being in possession of certain sealed artifacts. In the process of going back and forth, with difficult negotiations occurring and compromises between the two parties, an accident happened. One of them, Traveler Bodies, was lured by the true creator into joining the Aurora Order, which led to a terrible disaster. In this disaster, the upper echelons of the Abraham family were almost completely destroyed. More than half of the few powerful sealed artifacts were lost, and only 3 were left. As a result, Lawrence's brother, who he shared the same mother with, Richard, died. Not only did Bodies benefit greatly from it, but he also gathered all the Beander ingredients he needed, and with the help of the true creator, he successfully overcame the dangers and became a demigod, becoming one of the 5 saints of the Aurora Order, the Saint of Mystery. After the disaster, the rebuilt Abraham family's Elder Council reflected over the actions of the past few years, but they couldn't find a solution to the problem. Emotions such as negativity, dejection, and hopelessness shrouded the hearts of the few remaining family members. Lawrence didn't wish to be placed in such an environment or face sighing and repressed emotions every day. He found a reason to leave the Elder Council and came to Backland to look for his other brothers, Laubero, who he shared the same mother, and Sam, who he didn't share the same mother. But now, he suddenly realized that he was the only one remaining from his father's line. He was already nearly 80 years old, and all his children had died in the disaster brought about by bodies. Just recalling the past made him feel sorrow from the bottom of his heart. The most painful thing was that he couldn't see the hope for revenge, and he couldn't see the dawn of his clan's glory appearing once more. I'm already very old, and I was also injured before. Unless it's absolutely necessary, I wouldn't dare to use my Beyonder powers anymore, which would cause me to lose control or even cause the curse to descend. What is the future of the Abraham family? Lawrence took a sip of the Ferma coffee and fell into a long silence. Upon returning to her rented house, Furs immediately entered the bedroom and locked the wooden door behind her. She sat on the edge of the bed, calmed her mind, and whispered the honorific name that represented hope in the future. The fool that doesn't belong to this era, you are the mysterious ruler above the gray fog. You are the king of yellow and black who wields good luck. I wish to inform you of what I have encountered today. I met the elder brother of the husband of the old lady who made me become an apprentice. He seems to be a member of a certain family. I didn't mention anything related to mysticism, but I'm worried that he has extremely powerful divination abilities and will be able to find out the complete truth. At this moment, Klein happened to be above the gray fog. He saw the crimson star that represented the magician expanding outward, rippling as he heard the stacked layers of pleas. After figuring out the details, Klein tapped the edge of the ancient table and said to himself silently, how cautious for her to know to seek help from the fool. Besides, your guess isn't wrong. The corresponding sequence 7 for apprentice is astrologer. Having recently read the Book of Secrets thoroughly, he had quickly come up with a plan that would help him interfere with divination through rituals. I have to say, with the Book of Secrets and my advancement to sequence 7, I'm becoming more and more godlike when above the gray fog. Of course, for the time being, I'm still just an empty shell. Speaking of which, I've been acting in front of Miss Justice and Mr. Hanged Man several times, fooling them completely. Why didn't I receive any feedback from my spirituality? The speed at which I digest the potion doesn't seem to be getting faster as a result. Does it have to happen in the real world? Yes, it might be possible that their applause, as an audience, has been blocked by the gray fog, preventing them from directly affecting me. Just like how the eternal blazing sun and the true creator are unable to penetrate the gray fog to find this mysterious space. From the looks of it, the reaction between the gray fog and this mysterious space is very mechanical. It's not sentient enough, and it lacks intelligence. However, to me, this is actually a good thing. In the midst of his thoughts, Klein turned his knowledge into an ancient piece of goatskin and threw it into the crimson star that symbolized the magician. A boundless grayish-white fog suddenly filled the air in front of Furz's eyes, and an illusory yellowish-brown goatskin descended from the sky. When she saw the information written on it, she suddenly felt at peace. With Mr. Fool, Mr. Lawrence certainly wouldn't be able to get the correct revelations via divination. Furs sincerely expressed her gratitude and busily prepared for the ritual. She had seen a lot of instances where evil spirits did harm to others. In fact, she didn't trust the fool that much, but the curse of the full moon forced her to rely on him. Regardless of how bad the consequences are, I will just lose my life. Without the help of Mr. Fool, I would have already lost control during the last blood moon and become a monster. Every day I live is a day gained. This is all given to me by Mr. Fool, and he can take it back at any time. Well, it's best if he doesn't. Furs took a breath and lit the 2 candles that symbolized the fool. The initial steps of the ritual were no different from those she had mastered before. This continued until the candles were lit and the essential oils, extract, and herbal powder were thrown into the fire. When the fragrance of a serene etherealness filled the room, a faint, illusory fog covered the entire altar. According to the contents of the goatskin, Furs quickly adjusted her body and mind, entered cogitation and chanted the corresponding name of the fool over and over again. Such monotonous, repetitive behavior allowed the originally calm and relaxed Furs to slowly enter a state where the mind was in deep sleep while her spirituality dispersed. Her entire being felt groggy, but she maintained a strange sense of lucidness. She felt as if her spirit was floating about, constantly moving upwards. This was similar to the secret deed process that was formed with the help of an external object, but it was different in many ways. This was a technique in mediumship and was used to communicate with higher-level spirits. At an extremum, it could even allow a Beyonder to travel the spirit world under the pretext of maintaining a special lucidness. Some Beyonders who specialized in influencing the mind called it artificial sleepwalking. They could use techniques such as hypnosis to make ordinary people enter this state as well. In that way, an ordinary person would appear to be in a deep slumber, yet they would be able to answer questions. Although their eyes and mouths were closed, they could detect the presence of various spirit bodies around them, thus, completing a certain degree of communication. The reason why Klein didn't let FERS use the secret deed ritual was that it could only give knowledge or direct effects such as purification or corruption, letting the target's mind gain a wonderful experience. It couldn't interfere with the divination or other matters done by another person. Simply put, the secret deed ritual directly affected the target's spirit body, astral projection, body of heart and mind, and ether body. The related positive or negative states were removed, and with the artificial sleepwalking ritual, it allowed Klein to do something indirect so as to deal with any outside interference. In a daze, FERS felt herself drifting back to the majestic old palace above the grey fog, and she saw Mr. Fool sitting high above, looking down at everything. Klein looked at the image of the magician projected by the dark red starlight. He unhurriedly picked up a paper figurine that he had found earlier from his trash pile in the corner. As a seer who had advanced twice, he had many ways to interfere with the divination of others, so he didn't need to rely on mystical items to help him. At this moment, due to the effects of the ritual, the mysterious space above the grey fog started to tremble slightly, and some of the power was flowing due to the perturbation. Klein's left hand pressed the Dark Emperor card on the surface of the long bronze table, connecting it with his own spirit body and uplifting himself to a higher level. It raised his level just like the previous times he used the Flaring Sun charm and Azek's copper whistle to solidify his spirit body. Then, with a flick of his right wrist, he threw the paper figurine out. The paper figurine suddenly expanded in size, and on its back, 12 pairs of black angel wings which were cut out of paper grew out. The feathers were vivid and lifelike. The paper angel pierced through the dark red light and overlapped with the illusory figure of the magician. Without any warning, it started to burn and completely disappeared. The half-awake FERS seemed to see a dignified and majestic angel as it wrapped layer upon layers of pitch-black wings around her. After an unknown period of time, FERS suddenly awoke from her artificial sleepwalking state. In front of her were only the 3 candles quietly burning on the altar and the fog that had permeated the entire room. At the tip of her nose was the familiar fragrance of serene etherealness. Angel. FERS was so lost in thought that she momentarily forgot to end the ritual. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think there were 12 pairs of wings. According to the canon descriptions of the various churches, that's an angel of the highest rank. FERS tried to recall what she had seen in her reverie. She was both shocked and not that shocked, as if what she had encountered was a shocking event that she had previously taken for granted but had simply never encountered before. It isn't surprising that Mr. Fool has the services of an angel. From the fact that Miss Justice and Mr. Hanged Man occasionally use the word, him, to refer to him, one can imagine so. The fact that he's able to isolate the effects of the moon's ravings allows me to infer. However, my request was only to interfere with Mr. Lawrence's divination. Yet, he actually made an angel protect me. Isn't this too extravagant? Or is this a routine act for him? One more problem. Why are the feathers on the angel's wings black? Does this signify degeneracy or death? What is the true identity of Mr. Fool? Which great being is he? Death, who was rumored to have died in the Pale Era. He wishes to be reborn through the tarot gatherings? FERS suddenly took a deep breath, completely unconcerned that the gentleman named Lawrence would find anything wrong with her through his divination. On the realization that she had already joined the tarot club, she smiled wryly and whispered silently, I can only do as Emperor Russell said, take things one step at a time. After gathering her thoughts, FERS humbly thanked Mr. Fool once more. Following the normal process of a ritual, she extinguished the 3 candles' flame and began to clear the altar, which was filled with all kinds of items. Above the grey fog, Klein temporarily put the matter of the Abraham family at the back of his mind. According to his original plan, he conjured a pen and paper and wrote the following divination statement: Daisy's current situation. Putting the fountain pen away, Klein stacked Daisy's vocabulary book and the piece of paper with the divination statement on it and held them in his left hand. Then, leaning back in his chair, he entered a state of cogitation, reciting the words, Daisy's current situation, over and over again. After 7 times, Klein fell asleep, his eyes black with a hint of red before grayness surfaced in them. One scene after another began to flash. Some were contiguous, some had gaps, and some were completely incoherent. Klein saw Liv's youngest daughter, a 13 or 14-year-old girl who persisted despite being repeatedly scalded. She was dragged into a remote alley by a man wearing a heavy jacket and a grayish-black cap after he covered her mouth with a handkerchief from behind. Another man, who was dressed the same, took her legs, and they lifted her as they quickly walked away. Their destination was the carriage parked outside the alley. The whole incident was over in less than 2 minutes, and by the time Daisy's sister, Freya, returned to search for Daisy, the carriage was already gone. Within the carriage, a sharp, ice-cold dagger was held to the muddle-headed Daisy's face, and lewd threats rang in her ears. Ellipsis. The carriage drove into the luxurious villa. Daisy was in a small, dark room, and from time to time, the sound of women's cries, screams, and curses echoed outside. Daisy woke up and cried out for help, but the door was opened, and she was kicked away. The pain made it impossible for her to get up. She wept as she constantly cried for Mother and Freya. Ellipsis. Klein opened his eyes and realized that the paper he held in his left hand had already been crumpled by his tight grip. He had established that Capum was the mastermind behind the many disappearances of young ladies and that he was the boss of a criminal organization. The problem, however, was that the case shouldn't and couldn't involve powerful Beyonder forces. At most, there would be a few money-hungry Beyonders at sequence 7, 8, or 9 that were helping out. It wouldn't have made Klein's spiritual intuition give him warnings of intense danger the moment he approached the villa. Is Capum himself a sequence 6 or even sequence 5 Beyonder? However, it's not difficult for a Beyonder of this level to earn money. There's no need to do such dirty and complicated matters. He just has to find all the gangs and collect protection fees via a protection racket. It would be easy, and it wouldn't dirty his hands. Could there be some hidden plot behind Capim's human trafficking? As he pondered, Klein used the power of the gray fog to restore Daisy's vocabulary book to its original state. After a few seconds of silence, he took out another piece of goatskin and wrote a new divination statement. Saving Daisy is a dangerous matter. After reading it carefully twice, Klein removed the spirit pendulum from his left wrist, letting the topaz pendant fall and hang above the surface of the paper, almost to the point of touching the statement. After taking a few seconds to compose himself, he closed his eyes and began to recite the divination statement he had just written. When he finished reciting it, Klein opened his eyes and looked at the pendulum in his left hand. The topaz pendant was rotating clockwise at a fairly fast frequency and with a rather high amplitude. This meant that saving Daisy was a rather dangerous act. However, it isn't one of total despair. There's still a possibility, a significant chance of success, as long as I can seize it. Klein deciphered the revelation from the spirit pendulum. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and said with a self-deprecating smile, "Wasn't I looking for an opportunity to perform? This is it. As a magician, I have to challenge something of a higher difficulty. Otherwise, I would be called a trickmaster and not a magician. Completing the seemingly impossible, even if the outcome is nothing but an illusion, that's the image of a magician in my heart. As for whether it's one of the rules or not, I still need confirmation." Klein tapped the edge of the ancient table and quickly made his decision. To him, the most troubling thing about saving Daisy and dealing with Capum was that he didn't know anything about Capum. He didn't know how many other Beyonders were in the villa or the sequences and pathways they had. This made Klein unable to make specific preparations. And for a magician, the first rule was, never perform unprepared. Many seemingly impromptu performances actually involved significant preparations. For example, long periods of practice or thorough mastery of diverting attention away from the situation. Should I get Miss Justice's help to learn more about Capim's background for my adorer? Klein seriously considered the options available to him. However, he quickly rejected this idea. No, I won't be able to receive detailed information. Although Capum is involved with many powerful figures and the wealthy, it's not something that can be publicized. Miss Justice will, at most, learn of the nobles, members of parliament, or civil servants which he is involved with, but she won't be able to determine how many Beyonders are in his villa, much less the traps or the layout. Through the clues from these connections, Miss Justice might be able to figure out what I wish to know given a few weeks' time, but that's too slow. Rescuing Daisy needs to be done as soon as possible. Any delays will result in a tragedy. Klein's eyes swept across the surface of the long bronze table and onto the junk pile in the corner. His mind began to formulate an idea. On the one hand, I can get Miss Magician and her friend, Miss Zio, to investigate Capim's background and determine which Beyonders he has ties with. The two ladies are very well connected in East Borough, several gangs, and a considerable number of Beyonder circles. On the other hand, I can take action by myself. I can obtain information from the servants or bodyguards that come out from Kapim's villa via mediumship. After finalizing his plan, Klein was in no hurry to get help from Miss Magician. He decided to try doing it by himself first so that he could find out more about the matter in a targeted manner. In the blink of an eye, his figure disappeared from the towering palace above the grey fog. After lunch, a man wearing a greyish-black cap and a thick cotton coat cautiously left from the back door of Kapim's villa. He walked all the way to a crossroad and got into a rental carriage. East Borough. He touched the dark red birthmark on his face and instructed the carriage driver. The carriage began to move, and the man looked out of the window with a bored expression, admiring the beautiful ladies and young ladies on the streets. If only we could kidnap them. The man let his imagination run wild as he revealed a regretful expression. When he was far from Iris Street, he suddenly shivered, and his eyes became slightly dazed. He knocked on the wall and said to the carriage driver, "Stop, stop. I forgot something. Here will do." The carriage driver didn't dare to reprimand the ferocious man. He didn't even mutter as he stopped the carriage by the side of the street and allowed him to alight. After paying 6 pence for the ride, the man retraced the direction in which he came for dozens of meters before entering a cheap hotel. Without the need for any proof of identity, he paid for a room. After entering, he left the door ajar without locking it. Then, the man sat on the edge of the bed with a deadpan expression. Suddenly, a transparent and illusory figure separated from his body. It was none other than Klein, who was dressed as a worker. He had used the method of summoning himself to transform into a spirit body and had attached himself to this man's body, allowing him to walk to a convenient location for mediumship. After knocking the man out, Klein's spirit form disappeared from the room. Not long after, the door was pushed open, and he walked into the room in his corporeal form. Using a wall of spirituality to seal the place, Klein quickly set up a mediumship ritual, allowing the alluring scent of Amantha extract and eye of the spirit medicine to emanate in the surroundings. After finishing his preparations and just as he was about to start the mediumship, he suddenly exclaimed and stopped his actions. He discovered that the spirit body of the man who was unconscious on the bed had a mysterious, unknown restriction. If he forcefully did the mediumship, although there was a high probability of success, it would activate the seal and cause some Beyonder to notice this occurrence. This would end up alerting the enemy. Such a strange Beyonder power. Very cautious and very careful. What Kapim is involved in isn't simple at all. Klein took a few steps forward, frowning slightly. He glanced at the unconscious man and suddenly chuckled. "Do you think you can stop me with just this?" He quickly suspended the ritual, summoned himself again, and responded to himself. A few seconds later, he flew out of the candle's flame in his spirit body form and floated in the room once more. Without any hesitation, Klein, in his spirit body form, suddenly approached and possessed the unconscious man. The man suddenly sat up and opened his eyes, his expression appeared lifeless. He straightened his body, walked to the front of the altar, step by step, and then chanted in a low voice, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era, you are the mysterious ruler above the grey fog. You are the king of yellow and black who wields good luck." In a room filled with the ethereal fragrance of Amantha extract and eye of the spirit medicine, Kapim's henchman, who had been possessed by Klein, was made to chant the fool's honorific name. Amidst the monotonous yet rhythmic murmurs and the fragrance that made it difficult to focus, the man's spirit body gradually dissipated. He became muddle-headed but maintained a certain degree of unusual lucidity, as if he was hypnotizing himself. With Klein's help in his spirit body form and the feedback from the chanting the fool's honorific name, he slowly entered an artificial sleepwalking state. His astral projection approached the infinitely high grey fog in the mysterious location above the grey fog. Klein seized the opportunity, ended the summoning, and returned to the towering ancient palace, where he sat at the seat belonging to the fool. He saw a bright light circle rippling around him, sketching out the illusory figure of Kapim's henchman. The mysterious space was affected by the ritual as it trembled slightly. Some of the energy was being pried away and was slowly flowing. Klein picked up the Dark Emperor card, and a paper figurine flashed in his hand. With a flick of his wrist, the paper figurine flew out and absorbed the sliver of energy that had been pried out of the grey fog. It then transformed into a man wearing a black cap and a thick cotton jacket. He looked identical to Kapim's henchman, even his aura and feel was indistinguishable from the real person. This paper figurine overlapped with the target's illusory figure and helped him resist the mysterious and unknown restrictions placed within his spirit body. At the same time, Klein held the Dark Emperor card and spread his spirituality, touching the projection of Kapim's henchmen formed by the pure light. This was one of the applications of secret deeds, where a weak human and a great being were able to be a little in tune with each other, feeling the corresponding knowledge and gaining a wonderful spiritual experience. Unlike normal circumstances, Klein was playing the role of the great being in this instance. In this kind of close interactive state that belonged to a secret deed, humans could gain knowledge from great existences, and great existences could also naturally use questions to obtain the information they wanted. If it wasn't for Klein's inability to master the field of the mind, he would have been able to plant an inducing suggestion. What kind of powerful people are in Kapim's villa? Klein asked through the interactive spirituality state. Without any resistance, the projection transmitted the memories to Klein, making him feel like he was watching a holographic film. The man in the cap stood respectfully and fearfully in the room. In front of him was a middle-aged gentleman in a black tailcoat and a white wig. This gentleman had a long, thin, and stern face, and his mouth was naturally pursed, giving off an exceptionally cold feeling. He followed the golden chain on his watch, took out a pocket watch of the same color, pressed it open to take a look, and then he said in a deep voice, "Look at me." The man in the cap didn't dare to disobey as he raised his head and looked in front of him. "Yes, Mr. Harris." Before he could finish his words, he saw a pair of eyes that flickered with a strange light, and he heard a command: "Maintain secrecy. You can't leak anything you see or hear in this villa to anyone else." The man in the cap trembled inexplicably, feeling that he had to do as the other party had ordered. He lowered his head again and said, "Yes, Mr. Harris." Ellipsis. The man in the cap carried an unconscious girl along the stairs to the entrance of the basement. There was a small room that was separated from the others, and a bearded man with an unknown age was sitting inside it. This bearded man had a pair of frighteningly cold blue eyes. He held a thin piece of flannel in his hand and was carefully cleaning the grayish-white rifle on the table. The rifle was thick and long, connected through a pipe to a large mechanical box of the same color. It was a high-pressure steam rifle. That was a military-controlled item. "Mr. Belize." The man in the cap bowed his head in greeting. Ellipsis. The man in the cap entered a neatly arranged underground structure which resembled a prison. He then locked the unconscious girl in one of the small rooms. He locked the door, returned to the corridor, and picked up the lantern he had been assigned. At that moment, he saw a figure slowly approaching from the other end of the corridor. The figure seemed to be able to see through the darkness without any lighting. With the aid of the lantern, the man in the cap realized that it was a woman in her 30s. The woman was wearing a brown bonnet, a thin white blouse, and suspenders, as well as leather boots that reached her knees. There were old scars on her face and a cruel smile at the corners of her mouth. The man in the cap lowered his head in fear as he stammered, "Ma'am Katie." The woman ignored him. Step by step, she approached him and walked past him, as though he was nothing more than air. When the lady named Katie had left, the man in the cap curled his lips and said, "Bitch. When you get into bed, you'll definitely be more energetic than a prostitute." He pushed up his crotch, held up the lantern, and left the basement. Ellipsis. The man in the cap met two men in the grand hall that shimmered gold. One of them was about 1.65 meters tall, and he was a little plump. He didn't have any special features, but his eyes always had a frightening look. The other was slightly taller than 1.70 meters, and he looked a bit old. He had some wrinkles and a high nose bridge. His brown eyes were filled with spirit, and he didn't seem to have a look of deterrence. "Mr. Capum," the man in the cap greeted the plump middle-aged man. Then he said to another person, "Mr. Parker." In the early light of dawn, the man in the cap met the cold middle-aged gentleman called Mr. Harris at the entrance to the basement. Harris, wearing a white hood, glanced at him, who was standing respectfully by the side. He indifferently stretched out his right palm towards the entrance of the basement and solemnly said, "Confinement." Silently, there was a subtle difference in the surroundings. There are a total of 4 beyonders. At least 4 of them. The strongest should be that Mr. Harris, a sequence 6 at the very least, or maybe even sequence 5. I wonder what pathway it is. It does seem similar to the Dark Emperor pathway. Relying on order and issuing commands? Judging from the scenes just now, the restrictions pertain only to the basement, not the entire villa. That's right. With so many people coming and going during the day, it would be too troublesome to enter and exit once the restrictions are in place. I wonder if it's the same at night. Klein analyzed the information he had just received and asked again, "What's the overall layout of the villa?" He quickly received feedback and saw a magnificent hall, a wide dining room, connected corridors, washrooms, and scenes of the basement. Through them, Klein pieced together in his mind the rough layout of Kapim's villa. Feeling the drain on his spirituality, he asked a final question: who are the important figures whom Kapim is closely related to? The scene in front of his eyes was the magnificent hall from before. Half-naked girls were prostrating themselves while serving the guests drinks, letting them abuse them or fool around with them. Otherwise, they were being dragged directly to a secluded spot to be ravaged. They were young, and their faces were bitter and numb. Any slight delay or lack of enthusiasm would result in them being whipped by Kapim's attendants or maid-servants. None of these servants showed a shred of sympathy despite seeing such evil scenes. They fought to be the first to showcase themselves in a bid to obtain rewards. Klein saw Kapim among the guests, the cold Mr. Harris, and a member of parliament from the House of Commons who often appeared in the newspapers, Vardera, a fat man who was addressed as deputy chief. Is that one of the deputy chiefs of the Backland Police Department? That's one of the higher-ups of the police department. To think that not a single one of those servants are good. That's understandable. The villa's hired personnel must have been screened before and would have to be sufficiently trustworthy. Klein rubbed his forehead, halting the secret deed ritual. The man in the cap was only an inconsequential leader, and that was all he could know or participate in. Even at this moment, the mysterious restriction on him was still unperturbed. Klein ended the ritual and allowed him to vanish from above the grey fog as he returned to the real world. He sat by the bed and looked at the man in the cap who was unconscious. According to the information he had just gathered, he analyzed the feasibility of a performance and considered one plan after another. In the end, Klein came up with a definite idea. He whispered to himself, perhaps, I don't need a helper. A helper would drag me down instead, making it inconvenient for me to escape in times of danger. Picking the right time is very important. Nearly 50 minutes later, the man in the blackish-grey cap appeared in East Borough as he headed straight for the streets controlled by the Zeemanger gang. As soon as he saw a few dark-skinned, lean people with ferocious looks, he immediately went close. Pretending to not watch where he was going, he bumped into one of them. Damn it, you bunch of trash. The man in the cap cursed loudly and punched at one of them. Highlanders, who loved to fight, didn't back down and entered a brawl with him. In the process, the man in the cap pulled out his dagger, and the other Highlanders also drew their weapons. Slash! During the battle, a dagger stabbed into the capped man's neck as he failed to dodge in time. It went right into his arteries. The man in the cap fell as red blood pooled around his head. He quickly lost his life, and the illusory, transparent figure within his body immediately vanished. Klein returned above the grey fog, and using it as a springboard, he re-entered his body. He then opened his eyes in the cheap hotel in Sherwood Borough. He cleaned up the rest of the evidence and went to the front desk to check out of the room. On his way back to Minsk Street, Klein once again went above the grey fog. He wanted to divine a simple but crucial piece of information. He picked up a fountain pen and wrote down a line of text: Kapim's dinner time today. Putting down his dark red fountain pen, Klein picked up the piece of paper with the divination statement and leaned back in his chair. His lips moved as he whispered, Kapim's dinner time today, over and over again. Klein's voice echoed above the empty grey fog as his eyes rapidly turned dark, and his eyelids drooped. In a fragmented dreamscape, he saw the spacious, elegant dining room where there was gilded porcelain cutlery, caviar, roasted chicken, lamb stew, fried rib-eye steak, deep-fried dragon bonefish, thick creamy soup, and so on. The food was placed in a certain order according to specific requests in front of several diners. Among them was the slightly plump Kapim, the middle-aged gentleman in a white hood, Harris, the thin-bloused Katie, and Parker, whose face was rather unintimidating due to his old age. Looking out from the end of the dining table, he could see a window decorated with gorgeous decorations. Outside the window, the clouds were sparse, and the crimson moon was faintly discernible in the air. Klein opened his eyes and marked the location of the moon in his dream. Using his knowledge in astromancy, he quickly calculated a rough corresponding time. It looks like it's from 7:30 to 7:45 in the evening. Considering those few scenes, Kapim and the others have already finished more than half their meals, so I can push the time back by another 15 minutes. That way, 7:30 is the best choice. Klein muttered silently to himself as he interpreted the revelation from his dream divination. Eating at 7:30 was not a rare occurrence. This was even considered mainstream in the Lowen Kingdom and even the Northern Continent because many middle-class people, either due to their personal situations or because of low rent, lived in the suburbs and had to commute to work by taking the short-distance steam locomotive. By the time they got home, it was usually after 7 in the evening, so it was normal for people to have dinner between 7:30 and 8 o'clock. Klein had had the same experience in Tingen City, but that was because he had no servants and no housewife. Once the three siblings returned home, they still needed to busy themselves for quite a while before they could enjoy any hot food. It wasn't because they lived far from work. This was why civilians and the poor often had dinner between 7:30 and 8 o'clock. As lunch and dinner were separated by quite some time, afternoon tea, which should have belonged to the upper-class citizens, became popular among the middle-class citizens and civilians. When he finished the interpretation, Klein recalled the revelation he had just received. Klein became acutely aware of a problem. Where were Kapim's wife and children? They didn't appear in the dining room. Is Kapim an extreme believer in the Lord of Storms, so his wife and children have to eat their meals in the activity room? Or is there another reason? Or could he be unmarried and childless? He's already a middle-aged man. Klein tried to divine the situation, but he failed to receive any effective revelations, so he gave up. 7:30. He repeated the time once more before returning to the real world. In the evening, even at home, Kapim, who was wearing a formal bow tie, narrowed his eyes and looked at his subordinates before him. He asked in a slow but chilling voice, "Fabian is dead?" "Yes, boss." Even though he had been working with Kapim for many years, his subordinates still felt fear and horror. "Odysseus, call me Mr. Mr. In a few years, you'll have to call me Sir Kapim." Kapim loosened his bow tie and casually handled a thick cigar. "When did Fabian die? How did he die?" "This afternoon, I sent him to East Borough to do something. He ended up in a conflict with the Zeemanger gang and got stabbed in the neck." Odysseus described in a trembling voice. Kapim, who was toasting the cigar, said in an unperturbed tone, "Fabian is really a fool." "But are the Zeemanger gang fools to not know that he's my subordinate?" "Mister, as you know, Highlanders often join the Zeemanger gang when they arrive in East Borough, and they're barbaric and reckless, and they don't give a shit who's who," Odysseus quickly explained. Kapim snorted. "Have they forgotten that this isn't the Highlands? Or have they forgotten who I am? Odysseus, I want the body of the Zeemanger gang's leader from that block. Can you do it? If you can't, I'll sink your wife, your child, as well as you into the Tussock River." "Mister, no problem." Odysseus immediately raised his voice. He immediately asked in a low voice, "Who can I mobilize?" Kapim was about to reply when the door suddenly opened and the middle-aged gentleman with a white wig, Haraz, walked in. He gave Odysseus a cold glance before casting his gaze onto Kapim. "I heard that one of your subordinates had a conflict with a gang in East Borough and ended up dying?" "Yes, Mr. Haraz." Kapim stood up, cigar in hand. Haraz stared into Kapim's eyes and said, "You want revenge on them?" Kapim's forehead suddenly dripped with beads of sweat. "No, not at all." "Mr. Haraz, you misunderstand." Haraz nodded slightly. "You have to remember that during this critical period, we have to try our best to not cause any trouble unless necessary." He paused for a second and observed Kapim's reaction. "You are not the only human trafficker in Backland. We can support you, but we can also do so for others. You have to remember this point. The reason why I picked you was because you were vicious and shameless enough. However, you were extremely cautious. It wasn't because you were the biggest human trafficker." From the side, Odysseus listened to the duo's conversation. He wished that he was just a mass of air. That way, he didn't need to see how humble his boss, Kapim, was. Without a trace of anger on his face, Kapim smiled and said, "Mr. Haraz, my main concern is that Fabian's death isn't simple. It might disrupt your plans." "No, there's nothing wrong with his death," Haraz said in an affirmative tone. "I didn't get any feedback." "Is that so?" Kapim acted enlightened. "Then I'm relieved." He looked at Odysseus and signaled him to leave. He then lowered his voice and said, "Mr. Haraz, this time, there are the kind of goods you like from this batch." Seeing Haraz's expression soften but not show any signs of emotion, Kapim quickly added, "We've already finished gathering the ones that will be sent over." Haraz nodded slowly. "Send her to my room tonight." "Yes, Mr. Haraz," Kapim said with a big smile. After Haraz left, his face turned gloomy. He took a deep breath and whispered, "I hope that you can keep your promise this time. I don't want to be involved in anything like that anymore." He clearly remembered that year during the Harvest Festival, someone had come to him, hoping to get a batch of innocent girls. From that day on, the trajectory of his life had undergone tremendous changes. He had taken a fifth of the market share of the unlawful slave trade. He quickly became one of Baklan's rather famous tycoons, acquainting himself with several important figures and dragging them into the abyss of depravity. At this point, he desperately wanted to cover up the sins of his past. He wanted to let Capum undergo a catharsis, allowing him to become a true member of the upper class. However, for the time being, he was unable to do so. Glancing at the cigar in his hand, he picked up the framed photograph of himself with a beautiful woman and 2 children. Rubbing the surface of the photo frame with his thumb, Capum narrowed his eyes and whispered to himself, "After this deal, you should be able to return." At dinner time, Capum walked out of his study, a warm smile plastered over his face again. "Ma'am Katie, there's your favorite caviar and a roast chicken specially prepared for you this evening," he said to the woman in the thin blouse. Katie touched the old scar on her face and nodded without saying a word. Capum knew that she was silent and fierce, so he didn't continue. He watched her as she took her seat. Then Harris, wearing a white wig, entered the dining room, nodding slightly to each of the diners. The elderly Parker took a sip of his pre-meal wine, smiling as he motioned for Capum to sit down. The white napkins were spread out, and the food was served one by one. Capum raised his glass and chuckled. "Holy Lord of Storms, let's toast to a beautiful future." "To a beautiful future," Parker responded. Harris didn't say a word. He merely held the wine glass in his hand and made a gesture. Katie completely ignored them. At this moment, the classical clock hanging in the hall read 7:23. In a cheap hotel in the Baklan Bridge area. The disguised Klein took out his golden pocket watch, looked at the exact time, then he took out holy night powder, and he sealed the room with a wall of spirituality. After doing that, he quickly set up an altar and conducted a ritual. I summon in my name, the fool that doesn't belong to this era, the mysterious ruler above the gray fog, the king of yellow and black who wields good luck. Ellipsis. When the ritual was over, Klein immediately took 4 steps counterclockwise and went above the gray fog, ready to respond to himself. Inside the towering and solemn palace, he saw the door of summoning condensed by rippling light. It was a pair of illusory doors that opened outwards, covered with mysterious symbols. Klein was in no hurry to be summoned. Instead, he took out the sunbrooch and other mystical items, and he absorbed them into his spirit body according to his plan. Finally, he picked up the Dark Emperor card and let his spirit body envelop it. All of a sudden, Klein felt as if his spirit body had turned corporeal with flesh and blood. It was as if he could lift a gun and move a table and chair. A dark and ethereal mist rose up around him, and as the mist clung onto the surface of his body, it formed an imposing set of armor. He had a black crown on his head and a long cape of the same color on his back. At that moment, Klein was like an emperor about to embark on a journey. Dark Emperor. He examined the purifying bullets and revolver that he didn't bring with him before taking a step forward and entering the crack on the illusory door. Leaping out of the candlelight, he immediately flew under the cover of the night towards Capim's villa on Iris Street in Sherwood Borough. Not long after, he floated in front of the artificial fountain and approached the villa's entrance at a relaxed pace. The patrolling guards passed by him, but they didn't have any reaction. Since it wasn't really late into the night yet, there were no Beyonders on guard outside. In addition, Klein wasn't afraid that the powerful Beyonders inside would notice and have a premonition. It was because the Dark Emperor card possessed anti-divination and anti-prophecy characteristics. With a black crown and a solid suit of armor, Klein stood in the doorway, attuned himself for a few seconds, and took a step forward. His seemingly physical body silently passed through the door and entered Capim's villa. The first thing that met him was a spacious hall with lots of chairs and clothes racks, and behind it was a magnificent hall with gold as the main color theme. There was no ceiling, only a dome reaching 3 stories high. A giant crystal chandelier hung down, and on each petal was a pearly white candle. Through a thick, heavy door to the left of the hall was an elegant and exquisite dining room. The fragrance of roasted meat was the richest inside, concealing the smell of alcohol and other food. Klein was in no hurry to enter the dining room. He partially circled the exterior first, occasionally reaching out his hand to pull on the grayish-white gas pipes. It appeared as if he was experimenting with his physical strength, after carrying the Dark Emperor card, to see how much an impact he had on the real world. While he was a seer and clown, Klein's spirit body only had an intuition ability that was separate from divination. He possessed only 2 spell-like powers, which were to directly attack the soul and to freeze the target through contact. Once he advanced to the magician sequence, even if Klein didn't rely on the Beyonder powers of his physical body, he could still use paper figurine substitutes and air bullets in his spirit body state. In addition, he began to be able to possess others and gain basic control of the target. Augmented by the Dark Emperor card, the strength of his spirit body increased, and the number of items he could carry increased. His spell-like powers, which could directly attack souls, evolved into a Spectre's Shriek. It produced sound waves that were inaudible to humans but capable of damaging the souls of all living beings in the area. Similarly, the frozen effects derived from contact was clearly strengthened. After confirming everything, he found the corner of a wall and penetrated it to enter the dining hall. Then, suppressing all his emotions, he swept his eyes across the long table. The scene of Harris in his white wig, Katie in her thin blouse, Parker with his aged face drinking red wine, and the slightly plump Capum slicing his rib-eye steak caught his eye. Klein retracted his gaze quickly, not daring to look too much, lest the few Beyonders would discover him via their spiritual perception. With the help of the spiritual glows from the male and female servants standing around him, that is, the color of their auras, he carefully circled around the dining room and figured out the exact layout. For example, the size of the dining room was equivalent to the total area of his living room, dining room, and activity room. Another example was that there was a fireplace that burned with charcoal. It warmed the entire room via a pipe. There were 16 elegant gas lamps, and their lighting mixed together, making the room appear like it was daytime. Across from the fireplace was a wall which had hanging picture frames. There were sketches and oil paintings, all works of famous artists. That bearded Belize isn't here. He should be changing shifts at the basement. For a Beyander to be willing to do such menial work, Capum is definitely not involved in a simple matter of human trafficking. Klein thought for a few seconds, then he leaned against an oil painting of the sunset. He reached his hand into his body and unscrewed a translucent brown bottle's cap. It was the biological poison bottle. The reason why he paid so much attention to the time and chose to arrive at dinner time was because, at this very moment, the main figures were gathered here in the most orderly manner. It was the most advantageous for him to use the biological poison bottle. And with the tightly shut doors and windows during early winter, it allowed the effects of biological poison bottle to be more effective and have faster effects. In addition, Klein didn't soak the biological poison bottle to concoct the prophylactic drug before he came. He was currently in his spirit body state, so he wasn't afraid of biological poisons. With his spirit body's concealment and containment, he stood there silently and patiently admiring each and every one of the elegant wall lamps which were connected to the grayish-white gas pipes. Quickly, the odorless poison swiftly emanated outwards. Harris, with his white wig, sliced up a deep-fried dragon-bone fish, dipped it in black pepper sauce, and stuffed it into his mouth. Chewing and swallowing, he picked up the faintly golden champagne that was bubbling like a string of beads and took a sip in a good mood. He couldn't help but think of the entertainment that he would be experiencing that evening, the joy of a stubborn girl being conquered by him. This affected his appetite and made him unable to concentrate. Katie didn't get the servant to help her slice the roasted chicken. She was burying her head, holding a knife and fork, and like doing a precise dissection, she quickly divided the chicken into several pieces. They were all almost the same size. As Parker sampled the red wine and ate the stewed lamb, he would occasionally chat with Capum, who was sitting at the head of the table, and was considered as a guest that didn't sully the title. The dinner proceeded in an orderly manner, and finally, Capum put the last piece of beef into his mouth. He smiled at the three Beyonders and said, "Mr. Harris, Ma'am Katie, and Mr. Parker, tonight's desserts are from La Borega's head chef. There are 3 kinds, fruit caramel pudding, cream shortcake, and the carrot cake." Harris, who had always been cold, nodded slightly. "We love dessert so much in this country." As soon as he finished his reflection, he saw Capum raise his hand and scratch his cheek before scratching again. "It's a little itchy." Capum smiled apologetically. Before he could finish his sentence, he couldn't help but scratch one more time, leaving a clear bloody mark on his face. The bloody mark quickly swelled up, and his skin turned translucent. One could even see yellowish pus inside. "It's really a bit itchy." Capum smiled again. He scratched the original spot again, but due to using excessive force, the swelling caused the translucent skin to split open, and pus with a nauseating smell sprayed out. Harris narrowed his eyes and shot to his feet, looking around warily. "Ha ha ha, ha ha, ha ha ha." At that moment, he heard exaggerated laughter, and his body suddenly tensed up. He saw a male and female servant holding onto their bellies, laughing out loud. They laughed so much that they couldn't even straighten their backs. Tears flowed out from their laughter caused the room to turn completely silent. Like a chain reaction, the rest of the servants fainted or vomited yellow-green liquid continuously without end. None of them were spared. Bam! Katie flipped the dining table, letting the gold-plated cutlery and leftover food and wine to spill onto the floor. She had a revolver and a soft black whip in her hands. Parker stood up as well, but his mind appeared adrift. He looked at Capum crying miserably for help as he kept scratching and forcefully tore off a few pieces of flesh. For some baffling reason, he felt that the other party's ugly and disgusting appearance was quite the fine sight. At that moment, Harris realized that he was a little out of breath and realized that the room was probably filled with poison. He growled, "Hold your breath. Parker, open the door. Katie, follow me to find the intruder." At this moment, Harris was grateful that the dinner had been enjoyed with Capum, and there were quite a few attendants around. These ordinary people's ability to resist poison was far inferior to Beyonders. The fact that they showed signs ahead of time had allowed them to detect that something was amiss even before the poison had reached the deepest part of their bodies. Parker, who has the lowest sequence, should be the one with the most severe symptoms among us. Harris suddenly had this thought. Creak. As Parker opened the door to ensure that the dining room was no longer sealed, Harris, relying on his spirit vision, discovered an illusory figure quietly fleeting around. The figure wore a thick and imposing black armor, and a pitch-black crown on his head. A mask of the same color covered his face, making him look like a king from the spirit world. It was none other than Klein. Harris raised his right hand and pointed at the black figure that couldn't be seen by ordinary people. He chanted in ancient Hermes, "Imprison." All of a sudden, the black figure's surroundings turned viscous, as though it had transformed into a giant amber or produced a sealed, transparent wall. The figure was rooted to the spot, hardly able to move. Katie had taken aim long ago, and she pulled the trigger. They worked well together. With two bangs, the light golden bullet, filled with strange patterns, penetrated the viscous air and hit the black figure. The bullet pierced through and struck the wall opposite. The black shadow self-ignited, reduced to a roughly cut paper figurine. Within the pale golden flames, the paper figurine was quickly reduced to ashes. Paw! With a strange, crisp snap, the light from the 16 elegant gas lamps and the fire burning quietly in the fireplace suddenly lit up, leaving Harris, Katie, and Parker with only a brief flash of red before their eyes. Soon after, all the flames were extinguished, leaving the dining room illuminated via the human Height Street lamps outside the window and the crimson moonlight shining through the layers of clouds. It made the place abnormally dark and silent. Harris and the others once again relied on their spirit vision and spiritual perception to search for the ghostly intruder. At the same time, he realized that the poison wasn't showing its effects fast enough. It wouldn't really flare up until he finished the enemy. Therefore, he paid attention to the movement at the entrance of the basement. He pointed at the door again and said in ancient Hermes, "Confinement." The entire dining room suddenly froze, as if there was an additional layer of an invisible wall that even spirit bodies couldn't penetrate. Harris wanted to make it impossible for the intruder to escape. "I've found you." Wielding the revolver in one hand and the whip in the other, Katie noticed a black figure floating in the air. A strange light flashed in her eyes, and before she could attack, her mind buzzed as if someone had struck her head with a wooden stick. She felt as if she had encountered an indescribable shriek. A few drops of sticky blood slowly dripped from the tip of her nose. Harris only felt slight dizziness while the symptoms of shortness of breath seemed to worsen. Parker, the weakest of them, was seeing stars, and his steps became unstable. Suddenly, someone patted Parker's shoulder. A cold and gloomy feeling gushed over, causing him to freeze on the spot. It was as if he was completely covered in ice, and the cold moisture seeped into his bones. A familiar, deep voice sounded in his ears. "Imprison." Parker was instantly trapped by the transparent wall that imprisoned the door. However, Klein didn't possess him and went straight through instead, avoiding the effects of Harris's spell in a timely manner. Harris narrowed his eyes and waved his right hand. "Release." The invisible prison around Parker's body immediately collapsed, leaving not even a single trace of it behind. However, he didn't regain his mobility. Instead, he slumped to the ground, shivering continuously, as if he was still frozen. This wasn't only an aftereffect of soul touch, but also the effect of Klein's direct attack on his soul. Parker, who was only a sequence 8, was unable to recover in a short period of time. He couldn't even control his breathing and, as a result, inhaled large quantities of the biological poison, which was identical to the one in his body, once again. His weakened state caused the poison in his body to act faster. His eyes stared blankly as he instinctively changed direction. He saw Capum rolling on the ground and scratching his face and body constantly. He saw the thin strips of flesh hanging by the side of the wounds and the ghostly white color of his bones. Parker gasped and struggled to climb over. Capum, whose itch made him rip off the outer layer of his skin, suddenly discovered that Parker was crawling toward him with bloodshot eyes. He had a bad premonition, but he had no strength to dodge as he couldn't stop scratching. He didn't even have the ability to shout, no, except for using a blood-curdling cry as a substitute. At this moment, Klein, who had dodged the imprison spell, shouted, "Holy" in ancient Hermes. Then, he rubbed his fingers together and shot an air bullet through the dark golden sunbird brooch's coruscating glow. As soon as the air bullet was formed, it took on a holy luster and shot straight towards Harris's face. This was the holy oath provided by the sunbrooch, and Klein had augmented the air bullet with holy damage. Harris had long since changed his position. He was abnormally agile, and unlike a mage, he was more like a pugilist expert. As he avoided Klein's air bullet, he motioned for Katie to lash her whip to hold Klein back. When Klein's attack was interrupted, Harris took an iron black metal glove from a hidden pocket of his and tried to put it on his left hand. In his spirit body state, Klein didn't need to look out from the corner of his eye to see what had just happened despite not facing Harris. He immediately flew up, avoiding Katie's lash. He flew over the chandelier and pounced towards Harris. When Harris saw this scene, he held the black metal glove and pointed diagonally upwards. Exile. Klein was suddenly hit by an overwhelming and invisible force. His entire spirit body was blown away by the wind and hit the wall conjured by confinement, but didn't penetrate through it and escape. Seizing this opportunity, Harris put on the iron black metal glove. In the blink of an eye, he seemed to grow a bit taller. His authority was uplifted like he was a figure that could determine the life and death of others. The moment Klein was released from the exile state, he felt an inexplicable sense of horror. He couldn't help but want to lower his head, to prostrate, to listen to Harris's every word and obey every order given by him. His movements had become sluggish, and his pupils reflected a rapidly approaching Katie. "Paw!" Katie lashed out with her long black whip and hit Klein accurately. The long whip passed through his spirit body, but it brought a great deal of pain to Klein's psyche, as if someone had pressed a red-hot iron to the weakest part of his body. He jerked his head up and let out a scream. As for Katie, she pulled the trigger of the revolver in her other hand. Bang! Bang! 2 bullets, with a light golden glow, shot out one after another, striking Klein's body. Bright rays of light bloomed, and the figure wearing black armor rapidly thinned, turning into a paper figurine and quickly burning into ashes. Klein appeared in a dark corner. The sun brooch inside his spirit body was glowing with a dark golden light. Warm powers instantly filled his body, and the extreme horror that Harris had subjected him to quickly disappeared. One of the spell-like effects of the sunbrooch was horror immunity. In the short span of less than a minute, Klein had already been forced to use paper figurine substitutes twice. Although it was partly because he did it on purpose, it was still enough to prove the strength of Harris and Katie's joint attacks. It was enough to confirm the divination outcome which Klein had received. This operation would be quite dangerous. If Parker hadn't been temporarily crippled by the effects of the biological poison bottle and his initial surprise attack, the situation would have been even more dangerous. His plan was to rationally give up if all 4 paper figurines were used up and his opportunity had yet to appear. It wasn't because Klein didn't wish to prepare more substitutes, but because his spirituality could only afford 4 times while in combat. As for the confinement effect that Harris had created, Klein wasn't worried at all. He was now a spirit body that had been summoned. As long as he ended the summoning, he would immediately return above the gray fog. Unless it was intercepted by powers at the level of deities or the special effects of sealed artifacts at grade 0 or grade 1, nothing could interrupt this process. Previously, when Klein went to the Royal Museum to steal the Dark Emperor card, the woman who was suspected of being a high-sequence Beyonder was unable to stop him from leaving. This was the main reason why Klein dared to challenge the impossible even though he knew that the danger was great. Seeing that the enemy was no longer horrified, Harris put on his black metal gloves and signaled Katie to hold Klein back. He then pointed forward and solemnly said, "Spectres and wraiths are prohibited here." Klein's body that was covered in black armor immediately trembled as he was strongly repelled by a powerful, invisible force. However, the level of the Dark Emperor card was extremely high, causing the level of the spirit body to be relatively high as well. This kind of influence that was directly aimed at a particular existence was quickly suppressed. Harris narrowed his eyes, feeling that the intruding specter was very strange. He saw that Klein easily escaped Katie's intervention via flight, so he pushed his palm forward again and announced in ancient Hermes, "Flying and floating are prohibited here." All of a sudden, Klein felt his body become heavy, and he plummeted from midair to the ground. Katie quickly rushed over, and with a flick of her wrist, she lashed out with the whip that directed torture on the mind and soul. She still had many Beyonder bullets on her, but there were fewer than 3 that were targeted for specters and wraiths. Therefore, she temporarily gave up on using the revolver and only relied on her auxiliary weapon. Klein rolled on the ground, skillfully dodging Katie's whip. He heard the crack of the whip as it hit the ground. Katie was about to sweep the whip when she felt an itch at her throat. She coughed twice and missed the opportunity to continue her relentless attack. This was a sign of the poison acting up. Harris took a deep breath, held his breath once more. He folded his wrist, pointed to himself, and said, "Disciplinary target, wraiths and specters." The surface of his body immediately emitted a light as bright as the morning sun. Even his fist began to shine with lustrous brilliances. Bam! The marble under Harris's feet cracked soundlessly, and his tall, thin body pounced swiftly and fiercely, allowing him to immediately close in on Klein. At this moment, he looked even more like a knight than Katie. Bam! He threw a punch forward, and the air seemed to explode. However, Klein had pulled back ahead of time, dodging the punch with the wind. Pow! Katie helped from the side and lashed out with her whip in the direction in which her enemy was dodging. This forced Klein to have no choice but to roll again and again. He took on a fighting stance while keeping an eye out for Harris's spell like, imprison. As lashing sounds echoed, Harris kept attacking while Katie aided him from the side. In less than 2 minutes, Klein was forced into an unavoidable situation. Even rolling was of no use. Paw! Katie's black whip lashed out at Klein's face, and he was only able to take 1 step sideways before being hit in the arm. That piercing pain attacked his psyche once again, causing him to freeze on the spot. Even his spirit body became somewhat thinner. Seizing this opportunity, Harris clenched his left fist and solemnly declared, "Death." His body then merged with some sort of strange force, creating an obvious afterimage as he slammed into Klein. Schwing! The figure covered in black armor instantly broke into pieces, turning into pieces of paper that fluttered in the air like a butterfly. Klein had expended his 3rd paper figurine. Harris's gaze swept across the room and quickly locked onto the enemy that had appeared in the corner. He sneered and said, "Let me see how many substitutes you have left." In the process of searching for the enemy, he discovered that Parker was squirming on top of Capum. The scene was bloody and disgusting. It was a repulsive sight, both terrible and horrifying. However, Harris didn't have the luxury of time to save his subordinate. He was well aware that the effects of the poison would only worsen over time, so he had to get rid of the enemy as quickly as possible, so he couldn't be distracted. If he didn't, he would have to leave the dining hall first to recover from the poison, thus, allowing the enemy to escape without getting any useful information. He signaled Katie to go forward again, so as to hold back Klein, who couldn't fly or float. He took a breath and tried to catch a breather. There's a strange smell in the air. This is probably a result of the increasing toxicity of the poison. This thought flashed through Harris's mind, but he didn't think too much about it. He raised his left hand and solemnly declared, "The illegal intrusion of another's house is a crime." An illegal intrusion. While repeating the statement for a second time, Harris found it hard to breathe again. For a moment, he was unable to catch his breath, so he could only stop midway. He took another deep breath, adjusted himself, and spoke again. "The illegal intrusion of another's house is a crime." He repeated it 3 times, and Klein, who was still unable to extricate himself from Katie's entanglement, felt a baffling chill. Cough, cough, cough. Katie showed coughing symptoms again, and the flailing of her whip became sluggish. Klein took the opportunity to stop the embroilment with her, but he didn't attack her. Instead, he raised his head, opened his mouth, and let out a sharp cry that no human could hear. Hum! Katie's head jerked up, and her body swayed. She felt like the ground was bobbing up and down. Harris only felt a slight dizziness before returning to normal. He looked at Klein coldly and said in a majestic voice, "The guilty should be restricted." Klein, who was lunging at him, found to his surprise that his feet had seemed to be immobilized by invisible shackles. It made his movements suddenly turn rigid. Katie, who had recovered a little, swung open the revolver cylinder and quickly removed the spent and unused rounds. Then, she took out a quick reloading device and stuffed 6 rounds of ammunition, including her remaining purifying bullets, into the cylinder. Harris clenched his left fist and prepared for an attack. He wanted to chain his attack with Katie's shooting, in a bid to completely finish the enemy or to expend his substitutes. At this moment, the black-armored Klein smiled. It was because the opportunity he had been waiting for had come. He knew that it would take time for the biological poison bottle to show any significant effects. And once Beyonders sensed that something was wrong, they would act accordingly, either to find the hidden enemy or to escape the toxic environment. It would be difficult to seriously damage them or even finish them. Therefore, he had 2 other reasons for using the biological poison bottle. The first reason was to weaken the enemy. The second reason was to mask some smells so that Harris and the others would attribute all the abnormal smells they detected to the poison in the air. It made them focus all their attention on this aspect. This was the most important segment of a magic show, and also the key to success or failure. That abnormal smell was the smell of gas. The reason why Klein let the gas lamp and the fire in the fireplace suddenly brighten and extinguish wasn't solely to affect Harris and company's vision. It was mainly to attract their attention, so that he could destroy a few hidden gas pipes. In the beginning, he had intentionally put himself in danger in order to trick Katie into firing a bullet meant for wraiths and specters, so that she would no longer blindly fire at him and not trigger a corresponding explosion. He kept entangling himself with her and hadn't made any other attempts solely because he was waiting for the air to be filled with gas. Therefore, he kept holding back from using flaming jump or flame controlling. As for Harris's actions of using confinement on the room, he had expected it, but he didn't expect it to be this successful. Therefore, before he entered the dining room, he had kindly inspected the doors and windows to see if they were airtight. He had destroyed the hidden gas pipes in the hall, causing the area, both inside and outside, to become a huge bomb. Even without confinement, it would ultimately not affect anything. As a specter, Klein was undoubtedly unafraid of explosions. Lower-level ghosts might be annihilated by fire, but specters would at most suffer some damage. This was why Klein had to buy extra purifying bullets and the sunbrooch despite the fact that he had flame controlling. When he saw that Katie had raised her revolver and was about to shoot, and that Harris was about to pronounce death on him, Klein smiled and snapped his fingers. Harris suddenly felt a dangerous foreboding. However, at this moment, he saw that a flame had already lit up in the fireplace to his side, instantly igniting the surrounding air. Boom! With a loud boom, Harris's vision was instantly filled with an inferno that filled the room. It was as if he was watching a grand display of fireworks. Capum lay flat on the ground, itching and aching, wishing he could tear himself apart on the spot to rid himself of this hellish pain. Then, he saw a scarlet wave of fire that spread over in a flash, and he heard a deafening explosion. He imagined that this last moment would seem infinitely long and that it would allow him to recall all of the beautiful scenes when his wife and children were still by his side. He thought that he would feel relieved because he would no longer have to endure this inhuman torture, but at that moment, extreme fear and an intense desire to live surged from the bottom of his heart. And the so-called memories didn't even flash past his mind before he was overwhelmed by an excruciating pain before being plunged into deep darkness. Boom! The dining room windows were blasted apart, accompanied by countless brick fragments and rubble, as well as the burning tongues of fire that kept reaching outwards. The guards patrolling this area were immediately knocked over. Those who were lucky enough to not get hit had their ears left ringing. Their bodies either swayed, staggered, or fell. They saw that more than half of the dining room's outer wall had collapsed and that the flames seemed to be floating in midair. The residents of the entire street and the police officers in charge of the surrounding area heard a loud boom at the same time, leaving them confused and frightened. In the dining room, dressed in black armor and a black crown, Klein stood there, bathing in the red flames and enjoying the strong blasts of the waves without flinching. A lot of the black gases around him had dispersed, and even his spirit body had suffered some damage, but it wasn't serious at all. Beside a toppled table, Parker and Capum were blasted into a corner. Their heads were cracking and their bodies charred. The surface of their bodies was still quietly burning with flames, and the rest of the servants were in a similar state. In the area opposite the fireplace, Katie, who had been unable to avoid the attack in time, was slammed into the wall and then fell to the ground. Her body was mangled and covered in blood, and there were a lot of charred marks on her skin. Not a single piece of her skin remained intact. She wasn't dead yet, but she had fainted from her severe injuries. Even so, she still coughed while convulsing, inhaling large amounts of the lingering flames. The Black Whip also suffered similar damage. Many cracks appeared on its surface, and a small portion of the whip was ignited. None of the Beyonder bullets that she possessed were spared from the explosion. Katie was no longer capable of fighting. Harris had rolled in time to protect his vitals, but there was still a lot of blood and charred flesh on him. He staggered to his feet, revealing that his back, his hairband, and his legs were ablaze with red flames. His breathing became more difficult, and his body suffered relatively severe injuries. However, this was sufficient to prove the robustness and strength of his body. Or rather, having worn the black iron glove, his body became sufficiently robust, and his physique was sufficiently strong. However, this was within Klein's expectations. Since he was unable to assess how much damage his opponent could take, he had overestimated his enemy's constitution while coming up with a plan. Out of the corner of his eye, Harris saw that Klein was almost perfectly fine. His pupils shrank as he hurriedly stretched out his left hand and pointed in that direction. He said in a low voice, "Exile." Again, Klein failed to resist and was pushed away like scrap paper in a hurricane. He flew out of the dining room. In the hall outside, after the momentary ignition, the fire had already weakened. Another wave of disaster was brewing due to the wooden staircase, but the damage here wasn't too severe because the main body of the explosion had been confined to the dining room. Seizing this opportunity, Harris suddenly turned around and ran outside without looking back. Even though the flames covering his body were still burning, he didn't waste any time to deal with them. He knew that he was in a terrible condition and on the brink of losing control. Furthermore, the effects of the poison would soon reach its peak. Compounded by these two factors, he didn't think that he had any chance of defeating the intruder. It would be the same even if he had the help of the Sequence 7, Belize, at the entrance to the basement. Harris believed that if this battle continued, the only thing that awaited him was having the poison act up or him losing control due to his injuries. Once he decided to run, he didn't care about Katie, who was still alive, anymore. When Klein, who had just stabilized his body under exile, saw this scene, he immediately raised his head, opened his mouth, and let out a shriek that no human could hear. Harris felt a wave of dizziness, and his feet paused for a moment. His skin, which was still in relatively good condition, was now covered in dense, translucent blisters. This was an early sign of him losing control. However, he quickly recovered and continued his mad dash, escaping from the lawn of the villa. "He's really hard to kill." Klein didn't pursue him, in order to avoid an accident. He remembered that his goal was to rescue the victims and not to wipe away these degenerate Beyonders. More importantly, he had expended a lot of his energy and had suffered heavy injuries. If he were to give chase, he might not be able to stop Harris's berserk counterattack. "Paw!" Klein snapped his fingers and fired an air bullet. The bullet struck Katie in the head, ending her pain. Immediately following that, Klein turned around and flew towards the entrance to the basement. Belize, who had a full beard, had been keeping an eye on the situation outside, but he didn't dare to leave his post out of fear that the intruder's accomplices would take the opportunity to break into the dungeon. At this very moment, he held a high-pressure steam rifle and had his spirit vision activated. He had been frightened by the loud boom and became abnormally tense. Immediately afterwards, he saw the dignified Spectre fly over, and without hesitation, he raised his rifle and pulled the trigger. Bang! White mist was ejected from the barrel, and a sharp-tipped pale gold bullet was shot forward at an astonishing speed. Klein was prepared and long had a hunch. He had drawn out a small curve before Belize fired. The bullet tore through the hall, past the front door, and to the outside. At the same time, Belize rushed out of the duty room, holding his high-pressure steam rifle, and took on a threatening pose as he quickly moved towards the door. He believed that the intruder, who could deal with Harris, Katie, and Parker, would be able to easily kill him as well. Besides, such a big commotion must have attracted a lot of attention. He couldn't be certain that the mandated punishers would come over to investigate. Therefore, his only choice was to flee. Klein once again let out an invisible shriek, making Belize feel as if he had been smashed by a hammer. He saw stars as a few drops of blood dripped from the tip of his nose. But this didn't stop Belize from running. After shooting at Klein to stop him, he was already running into the hall, tumbling towards the door. Klein hesitated for a moment, then he gave up on chasing and fighting. He turned off the main valve, went to the entrance of the basement, and snapped his fingers repeatedly. Bang! 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 Air bullets shot at the invisible walls, gradually disintegrating the confinement. This was also one of the reasons why Klein dared to cause a gas explosion and use the biological poison bottle. With the effects of Harris's confinement in the underground dungeon, as long as it wasn't a frontal assault, he didn't have to worry about accidentally harming those pitiful girls. He destroyed the locks and flew into the dungeon, first finding the cell where Daisy had been held based on the revelation from his prior divination scenes. He then confirmed that she wasn't hurt too badly and was still able to move. Then, his body turned illusory and melted into the metal door. Creak, creak, creak. The iron doors on one side opened quickly, one after another, as though an invisible specter was running to unlock them. Creak, creak, creak. After one side was done, he did it for the other side. Daisy and the other girls were frightened by the explosion outside. After a while, she was surprised to find that the door to her cell was open for some baffling reason. Yet, no one entered. It felt like she could leave at any time. Some of the girls, who hadn't been disciplined at all since they were recently kidnapped, mustered their courage, got up, and attempted to run to the exit of the basement. They passed through the hall, which was slightly damaged by the explosion, and they left the burning villa's worsening condition, running faster and faster in the direction of freedom. When they reached the street, Daisy and the other girls thought to look back. Looking back, they could just barely make out an imposing figure standing upright on top of the evil building. It was clad in full black armor, and it wore a black crown. Whoosh! The cape behind the figure began to flutter silently. As they remembered the scene, they sought a nearby cathedral with their mistrust towards the police. When Klein returned to the smoky and burning dining room, he found that Parker's and Katie's Beyonder characteristics had just begun to show signs of appearing. He checked the items they were carrying and confirmed that most of them had been destroyed. Even their money was charred to a crisp. Klein jumped up to the second and third floor, quickly checking for any relevant clues. He didn't attempt to use mediumship, because he was short on time. And bringing them above the gray fog didn't meet the requirements of his curtain call. If even a minor leader was made to maintain secrecy, then these important figures would definitely have their own restrictions. They aren't good candidates for performing mediumship as I please. Furthermore, the previous series of required actions is too troublesome, complicated, and inappropriate for the current situation that I'm in. Klein ended his investigation with nothing to show for, but he picked up a deck of tarot cards. Returning to the destroyed, charred dining room, he took out all the major arcana cards from the tarot card deck and walked over to Kapim's corpse. Then, he specially took 2 of them and scattered the rest over Kapim's body. When this was done, he covered Kapim's eyes with the 2 tarot cards he had specially drawn. They were face up with their main side. By this time, Parker's and Katie's Beyonder characteristics had appeared. Tens of seconds later, an illusory door covered with complicated symbols appeared in mid-air outside the villa. The door opened without a sound, and from it, a handsome man in a crisp suit walked out. He looked to be in his 40s, mature and elegant. He had a pair of golden eyes, and with just one sweep of his face, he locked onto the dining room in the midst of the fire. At this moment, a strong gust of wind blew past, and a figure flew over at high speeds. It was an old man wearing a soft hat. His silver eyes had an abnormal seriousness to them. He was wearing a black robe with the symbol of the Lord of Storms embroidered on it. It was none other than the Cardinal of the Church of the Lord of Storms, the Archbishop of Backland, Spellsinger of God, Ace Snake. "Why are you here?" Ace asked in a deep voice. Any Beyonder-related matters in Sherwood Borough came under the jurisdiction of the Holy Wind Cathedral, so he was entitled to ask. The handsome man's expression turned slightly nasty as he replied, "I live nearby." They were close to the West Borough. The 2 of them didn't speak any further. They landed on the ground at the same time and entered the explosion site. A violent hurricane churned and swept away the flames, sending them to the artificial fountain outside. The wind seemed to have a life and intelligence of its own. The 2 demigod figures then saw Katie, whose head was shot and her flesh charred black, and Parker, who was entangled with someone else while his head had caved in and cracked. They also saw Kapim, who was covered in tarot cards, as well as the 2 major arcana cards on the face of the human trafficker. These were the Judgment card, which depicted an angel blowing a great trumpet, and the Emperor card, which was decked out in armor and was crowned. Almost at the same time, Cardinal Snake and the handsome man sensed something and turned their heads to look outside. They discovered a majestic figure in black armor and a black crown located at the top of the house by the side of the villa. The figure nodded slightly, and his cape was lifted. Then, without any warning, he disappeared, right under the noses of the two high-sequence Beyonders.